everybody to our utility meeting, or our budget meeting, the workshop. I was trying to think the right word. Budget workshop. Call this meeting to order. And I don't have an agenda in front of me, but Diane, are you starting us out?
Public comment first.
Okay. We'll open this up to public comment, if there be any. Seeing none, we'll close public comments. All right. Item number 1 is discussion and possible staff directive regarding the fiscal 2020 budget. Good morning.
Feels like we were just here. This is our second meeting with the council, but we've also had one meeting in between that with the citizens, which was held March 19th. I just wanted to add that. So when we had the first budget workshop, there was about 10 questions asked, and those answers have been provided to the council. In addition to that, we wanted to provide some additional information, which I will go over right now. Okay, so if you want to bring up the first slide that I want to briefly go over. Somebody had asked that we show the difference between the 2019 budget and the proposed budget for 2020. And I know these numbers are small, but I'll try to talk about the highlights. And I guess the biggest highlight to talk about is the salary increase, which is $1.7 million. This number is slightly less than what was originally mailed out to the council because several adjustments have been made. At the request of the city attorney, the attorney position, I'm not sure the deputy city attorney was removed, and the historic preservation officer position was reduced because some further analysis was done and it was decided the salary could be lowered, so that amount has been reflected in this. But the components that make up that increase are $628,000 of that is to fund the positions that were approved in the current year budget. So those positions are already in the budget going into next year, but the cost of fully funding those and the benefits are $628,000. Then there are the cost of the new positions offset by reductions in other line items. So if you look at the page, you can see that contracts have been reduced, maintenance has been reduced, and the miscellaneous operating has been reduced. And those three reductions help pay for the $867,300 of new positions that are being offset by reductions in other line items. And those would be mostly in the public works area, the HVAC position, and he may want to elaborate on those later, but that's the one that comes to mind, HVAC, but there's several other positions that are going to be in-house instead of getting contractors. So if we were instructed today to remove those positions, we would have to add back these line items because then we would have to be contracting those services out. So that leaves us with $233,000, which funds what we call not budget neutral positions. And those include the historic preservation officer, which is part of the goals of the council, the budget manager, which is near and dear to my heart, and I want to talk about that in a minute, and 2 police officers, which my understanding was to bring the police department to the staffing level it was at before the recession. So I'm going to veer off a little here and talk about the budget manager because that position is near and dear to my heart. And I think somebody said that we were getting top heavy and having managers. And I think I want to address that here and talk about when I came on board in January 22nd, 2018. When I walked in my office that day, I had to walk through another room, and that room was full of boxes. And it looked like there'd been a major audit or something, and all the files were out. And, I just said, well, I'm sure we'll clean that up. Well, it didn't really get cleaned up. So every day I'd walk into my office through this room of boxes. And there was one person working in that office, but there was boxes everywhere. So at one point I said, okay, it was May, I think late April, and I just couldn't stand it anymore. I said, we got boxes everywhere. I have 40, 50 phone calls a day that I'm trying to answer, plus working on this budget, then getting a new city manager in the middle of all that. It was crazy. Okay.
Which was the worst part?
We'll talk later. So, okay, that's where I was. That's when I walked in. I'm like, what did I get myself into? But at that point, I said, okay, I've got to fill this position called administrative coordinator for the finance department, because that position was in the budget, and I was told, you can fill that. And I'm like, how do I have time to fill that? I mean, my phone's ringing 40 times a day. I'm working on a budget. There's stuff all over my office. Okay, so I advertise the job, or Bryce does, and I get 7 applicants. I'm like, oh my God, I got to talk to these people. So one of them is here, the person I hired, Carol. There she is. And what I told each one of them was, I said, this is a speed date. We have 5 minutes. And I asked them 10 questions. And Carol was the lucky one who got chosen. So her first day was, I think she said June 21st or something. So all that time, it was just me and 3 other people trying to handle everything. So she walked in and she said, what do you want me to do? I said, can you work on these boxes? She cleared out 90 boxes. That room now, it has 2 desks in it, 2 full-time staff, and we have space to put stuff. But she cleared out 90 boxes in 6 weeks. The bad part was she was clearing out 90 boxes of stuff. The good part was when people would call, she'd say, I think I've seen that. So she would go and find it and help people. So that was her baptism to Boulder City. So then the budget comes, and I'm allowed to have a analyst. I think that was approved in current year budget, and a purchasing manager. So it was still a crazy period of time, but I finally got around to hiring the analyst in September. And her name's Angela. She's not here today because she's finishing up a conference in Dallas on the computer software we use. So she started like September 15th, and she goes, what do you want me to do? And I said to her, you may not remember this, but I said, I need you to split up the utility into 4 separate funds. She said, okay. So she worked diligently on this, and it was her first project. I mean, she started, and that's what I asked her to do. So she worked on this for a while, and I had to kind of intricately divide all the departments, all the divisions into separate areas with separate balances. And I presented this last October. And this will come back in our discussions when I continue going through the stuff. So then when she finished that in October, I said, we're doing a major computer upgrade, which has to happen January 1st. So now I need you to work with every city department and coordinate this to make sure it happens. And again, she's a new employee. She's never used Munis. But she had read up on it. She was in that first speed dating round. And when the second round came up, I told her that I needed someone who would know Munis. And well, I think I said that during the first one. And when the second analyst position came up, she came and she said, I've been studying Munis. I think I know it. So she worked on this upgrade, and she got to meet, she knows everybody in the city. They know her, they call her. And now she's been working on the budget with me. So January 22nd, I filled my latest, what I call my latest right hand, which is the purchasing manager. Now, he's a manager, but if you think of a manager as someone who sits back and does nothing all day, that is not Paul. So Paul, can you wave? There he is. That's Paul Sikora. And every week I meet with my staff for about a half an hour and go over where they're at, what they're working on. Paul started January 22nd, and today is April 10th. So the things he's working on right now is MOU with Muni Court and Clark County for shared funding, MOU with Henderson for Safe Nest program, safety program management proposals, GovQuote licenses for departments, free online quote tool available to government agencies, citywide phone service upgrade project, RFP for Nevada Way painting, Visa View First Amendment, cooperative purchasing training tool, Munis vendor EFT and email verification project, forensic laboratory testing agreement with Boulder City Hospital, cost analysis of copier program for the city. He's starting up the vehicle equipment and replacement committee. He has recently done for me a request for proposals for municipal financial advisory services so that if this pool passes, we have extra people we can turn to and try to find any types of funding available and creative, I don't want to say creative financing, but they may have some ideas that we haven't thought of because they do it all the time. So that's just some of them. Now he's also got a list equally long of what he's completed since January 22nd. We still, every day, are flat out busy. Now, I don't know about the other departments. I'm speaking from my position here. And, I don't think we're top heavy. I work with everybody every week. We meet, and if there's issues, we work them out together. I ask them to add things to their list. They tell me problems they have, and we work that way. So that's my plug for the budget manager position. So now we can continue. All right, so that pretty much covered the biggest changes in the budget from 2019 to 20. It's the positions, and most of those positions are carryover from current year. The 233 is the new positions that would not be considered budget neutral. And one other thing, we are tracking savings. Carol, I'm bragging on her a little bit. She's been working on getting funds from the state because we were told that there was funds at the state level that we might be due, and we received a check this week for $120,000, and that's something that without the staff that I have, we wouldn't have realized that money. We might have paid another firm to go out and get it for us, but she took it upon herself with her workload to do that. So that's pretty much the biggest changes. I have at the top the changes that we have in the revenues, and those are based on the state, and the biggest increases in solar leases. So then we'll go to the next page, which is the 5-year cash flow, and this is just pretty much to bake into the general fund the cost of these positions so that maybe add some comfort level to the council that we're not being irresponsible, that we can afford to staff these positions and still maintain a healthy fund balance and still take care of our emergency reserve and our operating reserves. Okay, the next page, I asked you to remember this from back in October. So now we're talking about the impact of canceling utility rate increases. So when this was done last October, I think I compared it to school children, and we had an A student, a B, a C student. Might not remember that, but water was definitely the student that was hurting the most. And what we did was we took the cash flow developed and took out all the rate increases to come up with the impact of canceling the rate increases and put in there the most recent budget figures that we have in the actual. So it just kind of flows through. Kind of like the same thing if you look at that general fund, the way that works. This is how this works. So if you want to show the electric fund, so the projected fund balance, if we have the rate increases that are scheduled for fiscal year 20, the projected fund balance is 2.8 million. There is no 2.5% automatic for the electric fund. This is just based on the changes that were recommended by the last rate study. So that's the implementation, the last series of implementation changes there. So if we wouldn't do those changes, we would lose $604,000 off the fund balance. And when you don't have these increases, you have a hard time recouping them if during these rate studies that happen in the upcoming year, we discover that there's some serious issues that need to be taken care of, and we need X amount of dollars. Now you're at a loss because you have not sort of baked into the rate structure the increases. So now you might be having to have a 10% rate increase if we discover during these studies that are upcoming in the upcoming year that there's serious issues. The impact to the citizens would be greater than if we just stay constant and use what we've been told by the last rate study to use for our going forward amounts. And the other part I've heard is that we got into some trouble because there were no rate increases for several years. So this was kind of to catch up and fix that, and then going forward, keeping it at the 2.5% until a new rate study happens, and then we determine what the condition of the system is, whether we're overcharging or undercharging, but at least then there's a foundation. But if you cut off all the rate increases that are scheduled right now, you could do some serious harm to the fund balances in each of those funds. So the electric fund would probably be the healthiest, but some of their costs, and Keegan might want to address this, are, one major problem or a couple of major problems could cost a lot of money. And some people might say a $3 million or a $4 million fund balance is a lot for the electric fund, but not if they have a serious issue. Money is needed to maintain these systems, and it's not like replacing a light bulb. It's bigger ticket items. So the first column is if we have the rate increases, the projected fund balance. If we have no rate increases, what the over time of impact of that is, and what the projected loss is over that 5-year period. And that's probably the best looking one. So now we go to the next one, which is the water. So for the next 4 years, a lot of the projects being done in the water fund are being funded by the voter-approved funds, that they approved the use of the funds for the utilities. So they're being subsidized by the voter-approved funds. And in fiscal year 24, that program ends. So then they would definitely fall into the red with no increase. With our constant 2.5% increases, they would be above water, so to speak. And that's pretty much all I need to say about that. Wastewater fund, we show two scenarios. And even with the 2.5%, with the 2.5% increase and the big project which people have mentioned about reusing the water, or the wastewater that goes into the desert, and I don't know if this will be done or not. I mean, that's more of a question for the two gentlemen sitting there. But if that project were to happen, where we're trying to not just dump the wastewater into the desert and reuse it, the cost of that project would be about $2.5 million for starters, and that would put the wastewater fund in trouble either way, even with the 2.5% rate increase. If we took that project out, they stay okay with the 2.5%, but fall into the red without the increases. And the last page of that, the last slide, just shows what the asterisks mean. So that force main project at the treatment plant is the $2.5 million that I guess we could take out if we don't want the wastewater fund to go into the red. We could take it out, but then you're not reusing that effluent that's going in the desert. And then the other bullets are self-explanatory. And the one thing I do want to say is this includes, for the funds, maintaining the required 20% fund balance and a proportional share of the $5 million emergency CIP fund for utilities. So the ending balance is after these contributions. I think maybe now we could have some questions because or direction.
So just real quickly on all this, the utility slides, since you were mentioning the big water project, I'm assuming, because we don't have the backup here in front of us, but I'm assuming this includes the capital projects that go out 5 years?
Yes.
Okay. Factors that in. Okay. Council, questions, comments?
Just a question, Mayor. Thank you. And a couple questions, but that wastewater project, since that's the last thing you talked about, what's the total cost of that? I think it was like 14 million.
Dennis Porter, Utilities Director. It would probably be higher than that if you had to do advanced treatment to discharge either into the Colorado River or back into Lake Mead. You have to meet different water quality standards because of those uses in those water bodies. So to go to advanced treatment, you're talking about probably a whole new treatment plant that could treat to much higher levels. And for for a 2 million gallon per day plant, that's probably in the $20 million range.
Okay. So we do have 2.5 million budgeted though towards that project.
I believe the 2.5 million could do a couple of different things. One, it could get you through the study design phase, but I think what they planned for that 2.5 million was more for discharging the current effluent to some different locations that are yet to be determined. Right now, we only have one potential customer that I'm aware of, and they would only use 200 or 300 acre feet per year. So at this point in time, there's no other place to put that effluent without treating it to a different quality.
Okay. I might have more questions as we move along here during this workshop, but Diane, thank you for sharing some insight into what happens down there in your department. Had no idea about the boxes, and it was a funny story, but also very informative. So thanks for sharing that.
Thank you. Others?
With regard to some of these capital improvements, one, the wastewater, I know that my suggestion for it was if we are to do something like that with that discharge water, to talk to SNWA. They're the ones who recover credits for any water that we might be able to reclaim. So when we look at these figures, I think it's important to keep in mind, are we going to be able to get revenue from other sources? Currently, we have a system in place and the dollars have already been spent to put that system in place. So if we're going to do something in the future, that may not be Boulder City money. So I just want to make that point that with these types of projects, we have other partners that we may be able to look to for revenue. Similarly with the wastewater, as I recall, one of the capital improvement projects is actually calling for a replacement of our wastewater treatment plant. Is that correct?
No, the only project in the next 5-year period beyond what we just talked about is the replacement of the headworks. That's about a $400,000 project. That's something we'll take a look at to see if there's something we can do differently today, because I wouldn't want to spend $400,000 knowing that we were going to have to do something totally different. So that's just something we're going to have to figure out. But right now, that's the only treatment project in the upcoming CIP.
Yeah, because as I recall, and this was from last year, which is before your time, so I'm not trying to pin it on you, but I recall that there was a project, I believe it was a $20 million capital improvement project for either replacement or expansion of the existing wastewater treatment facility.
Yeah, it was included in there, but it wasn't shown as funded.
Okay. And again, I guess that's another thing that when we have these projects that are set out in the budget and money's being shown, you know, Mrs. Pelletier, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit when you show these as losses. They're not losses, they're just revenues not realized. We're not collecting that money, but we haven't lost that money either. So when we look at these figures for all of these different funds, I think it's important to keep in mind that part of the reason for budgeting a rate study, and we do have that budget, is that correct? A new rate study?
That's correct.
And that's going to be in the current fiscal year?
Correct.
Okay. And our last one was done in
2015, I think. Yes.
Okay. So the idea of not collecting increases until we have a better idea of what this new rate study might bring us is to give us that idea of what we need. You know, there were many things that I saw in the past rate study that seemed to bake in a lot of growth here in Boulder City. And if we don't realize that growth, if that growth doesn't occur, then we're not expending that money. And that would reduce the amount of projects in the capital improvement fund. So I think it's, you know, the numbers I'm sure are accurate. The problem is, were they necessary in the first place? And are we asking the ratepayers to pay this up front, and then we'll see if we need the money? So I would prefer to get a rate study done, a current one, hopefully one that does not bake in a lot of projects that are projected for growth, and see where we come out at that time, rather than asking the ratepayers to give us more money now that we may or may not use in the future. So that's just my comment on these projections for the different utility funds. Going back to the positions, the new positions that are being requested, I know when I was first elected in 2017, which again was prior to Mrs. Pelletier being here, I visited with the one person who was in the finance department at that time, and I looked around and said, where's everybody else? Well, there wasn't anybody else. So I understand that. I understand some of these positions are necessary. We did approve positions for your department previously. A concern I have is you have a purchasing manager now, is that correct? That's one of the positions you have?
Yes.
And in the new positions that are being requested, I believe we have a position now for an administrative services person.
That's a transition position. That's not a new position, and that's Bryce, right?
Administrative services, is that what you call it?
Is that the Administrative Services Director?
Yeah, I think I said administrative services.
Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't hear Director.
Perhaps it went through the translator up here.
That is not a financial position. That is a director-level position that oversees HR, IT, and airport services, and also administrative policies and whatnot, and special projects for the city as a whole.
Is that a reclassification of Bryce?
That is actually a reclassification. That's all that is.
Okay. So he'll be taking on new duties, though, is that correct?
No, he's not actually doing those duties now.
But not officially.
He's doing those duties now.
Well, again, we're showing money in here, and it's like,
Right, but those monies that you're showing there is his actual salary as it is today. There is no increase in salaries whatsoever. In fact, in that particular position, what I'm proposing is that in the future, should he retire or leave the city, any replacement would actually come in at a lower rate of pay than the current rate of pay that the incumbent has.
okay. Again, my concern is that we have added staff. We have now brought our employment levels back to where they were prior to the recession. And I supported those last year because it was apparent to me that we were lacking personnel that were necessary. When you add our utility fund together with our general fund, somebody trying to process $70 million, that's not a two-person job or even probably a 3 or 5-person job. So I understand that. And there are real savings. You've already pointed out some of those savings that can occur when you have people who are able to actually dig into the numbers and see what's happening. So I appreciate that. But my concern is that we're creating all these positions, purchasing agents, whether it's a reclassification of someone's existing position to take in more responsibility, that we're not starting to overlap some of these things. And we need to keep in mind that we've not grown here. It's not that we're having to provide more services. We're providing to the same number of people that we have before. We are getting new money in from the solar leases. And at some point, I would like to see us start to devote some of that solar lease money into things like the utility fund, which was part of the proposal when all of that began. I know there is some money that goes into that, but I think in this budget of the new solar lease money that will be coming in, if all of these positions were approved, that would only leave about $200,000 out of the $1.8 million in new funds that would be available for something else, looking at the figures. And there are a lot of figures though, so I may be incorrect.
Okay, could you repeat your question on that?
What was it, a long one? The new solar money coming in is about 1.8 million, is that correct?
Well, in fiscal year 1920, we have approximately 14.4 million solar lease payments that will be realized.
I mean an increase.
The increase. The increase is 1.7, I believe.
Okay, and all of these new positions would take up?
Well, the new positions, the non-neutral positions are 233,000.
So, I don't want to interrupt, but can you explain, because I'm trying to figure that out. When you say non-neutral, those are new positions or upgraded positions?
Those are new positions. Well, the new positions that those are are the historic preservation officer, the 2 bullet points at the bottom of that, the budget manager, and 2 police officers.
So those are the new positions?
Those are the new budget, non-budget neutral.
So they're actually a salary, there's an actually increase in cost associated with them.
So in that figure, then, you don't include the ones that have been reclassified or upgraded, because that's also an increase as well. Because
the reclassified ones are just a name change.
No, there's several. I think I counted 7.
There's some upgrades.
Yeah,
there are some upgrades.
So but that's a cost increase.
However, if I can just interrupt, those job classification changes or the upgrades are being paid for by other savings in the budget that comes from the departments where those positions originate from. So if those upgrades are not approved, then those monies that were identified to help pay for those would go back to provide, the services that those monies were covering in the first place.
And those are projected gains rather than, in other words, I know that Public Works has a few positions, at least 2 positions, where they feel that contract work can be brought in-house and therefore
Correct. It's the same, the same
savings.
process, right? So, as an example, and Public Works is actually a good way of looking at that. Is currently in their budget, they have every year they have money in there for maintenance of HVAC system, for plumbing, for a number of facility-related projects needs that come up. By bringing that portion of their budget down and using those revenues to fund the new positions and bringing those positions in-house, it actually creates additional availability of resources. We can do those projects in-house and in fact possibly even increase what we do in-house and create even larger savings for the city by not having to resource or outsource some of those particular projects, maintenance related activities.
Well, the point I'm trying to make is we know the salaries for those new employees are going to be a fixed cost. You hire somebody, you're going to have to pay them. The savings are projected savings.
And the savings are projected over the years because, again, what we did was we wanted to make sure that any revenues that we are using that are currently in the budget are recurring revenues, or, I'm sorry, recurring expenses. And so we want to make sure we match recurring expenses with the new recurring salaries, if you will. So we don't want one-time revenues trying to cover multi-year expense.
Well, I know somewhere I saw that our increase in the total general fund expenditures comes very close to the new additional revenue coming in from the solar leases. And as I recall, it was just around a $200,000 out of the 1.7 million that would actually be money available for something else. 1.5 million was being committed to either salaries or other projects. You know, there's so many numbers, I look mostly at bottom line, so that's where I come up with those figures.
Well, in the year-over-year explanation, it does show that the increase in solar leases is $1,691,000. The increase in the salaries is $1,785,000. So actually, that doesn't even cover it. But again, over to the side of the $1,785,000, we kind of explain the three types of categories that make up that increase. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, it does, and that's very helpful, but again, the point I'm trying to make is we're getting new money in, and we like that. That's a good thing. When we have these new projects go online, we get new money in. But as soon as we get the new money in, we commit it to either hiring people or, in other words, we don't seem to be able to direct that money into things like our infrastructure.
If you look at the five-year projection, and you look at the bottom line, which is estimated cash and cash equivalents less reserves, that is the balance that's available for capital and debt service, and that continues to grow even with these positions funded going forward.
So if I may just interrupt, if you'll take a look at your year-over-year comparison, FY19, FY20, if you look at the column FY20 and look under total, it's $34,633,611. And then you follow that column all the way down to subtotal under expenses, and you see the figure $32,837,401. And the difference between those two is a positive $1.796 million. That is money that the staff is not recommending to be expensed, other than we're recommending to the council that you consider that revenue that we are not looking to expend elsewhere, really for the council to look at it in two areas, and that is you could choose to use that money to pay for additional capital projects, or you could use that money for debt payment if you so desire, or whatever the council's wishes are. So to your question, Councilmember McManus, you're specifically identifying one specific revenue source that is increased by 1.6 million. There's actually a number of revenue sources that are increasing last year over this proposed new budget. The reality is that when we do all the pluses and minuses, we're presenting a budget to the council and basically saying we have $1.7 million that have not been identified for specific expenditures, And we're making a recommendation to the council that you take that money and you can either choose to put it into capital projects, you can choose to maybe pay down some debt service, or potentially, as you know, that we talked about, that we do see some potential capacity for future debt payments if the voters say should approve a ballot measure, that we do have potential available resources to be able to pay additional debt if the voters want to take on additional debt.
Or we could focus those revenues on keeping our utility rates where they are.
And and that's certainly a policy decision by the council. But as you know, NRS, I want to say the 800 series talks about, is it what?
I have a comment.
Anyway, the NRS has specific language, a section dealing with enterprise funds, the purpose for...
I'm familiar with that law, but that doesn't apply to that solar money. That's not considered an enterprise fund.
No, but
is that correct?
No, what you're asking, though, is can we use the solar funds to supplement the enterprise funds? Technically, yes, you can, but it does kind of fly in the face of the reasons why you establish enterprise funds, because they're supposed to look like a fully functioning and supporting business enterprise. As we know, though, in local government, sometimes that's not exactly what occurs because, as you know, we have the golf course.
What I'm getting at is the solar funds are not committed to an enterprise fund. That's up to council to decide how to use that money.
That is true. That is correct.
Okay, and my reading of NRS 354 doesn't say that the only revenues that can go into that fund must be generated from that fund. There are prohibition about taking funds out of that fund and using them elsewhere, which is what got our utilities in the hole in the first place here.
That is true, but it also defines the purpose.
If we have new money coming in, to be committing that back to things that should have been done years ago, I don't think that has any problem with NRS 354.
Are you talking about our policy as to where the solar funds go in the first place? In terms of whether they go under the general fund or the capital improvement fund?
The solar funds aren't an enterprise fund. That money is available to use how we deem best.
That is correct. You can use those funds however the council deems necessary.
Okay.
Mr. Harvey, we'll get to you in a minute.
I have a comment. Can I go ahead?
Go ahead. Yep.
I'm somewhat at a disadvantage here with what I can relate to. But I do have the orange or the blue tentative budgets that were delivered to me some time ago.
Yes, the executive summaries.
And from those, I see two numbers that stand out of an increase in revenues. One is the C-tax. It had been mentioned that there's been an average of 4% increase per year due to the recovering economy in southern Nevada. From my calculations, that amounts to about $1.2 million additional from the C-tax. In regards to the solar leases, the anticipation is $1.8 million from the solar leases. So together, those are about $3 million of increased revenues in the city. Now, I understand that there's also increased expenses because of salaries and positions. And in regards to the positions, I really had no difficulty with the city reaching parity in terms of its pre-recession employment level. That was easy to explain to folks. But when the request comes for 15, up to 15 additional employees, and I understand that there's one sentence or two sentences in the tentative budget about how this would replace contracts that we're playing out now and bring it in-house. But at the last budget workshop, I requested to have a paragraph with more than one sentence. I'd like to see a paragraph that includes a financial justification for bringing these, hiring these people and bringing these tasks in-house. And I'd like to see a functional justification for bringing these people in-house. As you know, a contract, at the end of the contract, you can have the ease of not renewing the contract. However, with individuals, it's a much different thing. Now, getting back to that $3.2 million increase, the budget is the most important thing City Council can do during its term, because it reflects what the philosophy of the council is in terms of governance to its people. And I would have to say, just a citizen on the street and not a councilman, and I learned that there was an increase in revenues, and that basically that increase is going to be swallowed up by having more employees and quote unquote better services. I feel somewhat shortchanged. And what I would like to propose is that there is a portion of our revenues presently that is essentially a regressive tax on our citizens. And that is the connection fees for electricity and for water. Now, the issue of electric rates is a separate one from the connection issue, because electric rates, of course, are going to be varied by what the cost of the electricity is. In terms of the connection fee, however, many people cannot conserve their way to reduce a connection fee. It's a fixed fee. And from my calculations, just the estimations on this, the connection fees for electricity, we received from the city $600,000, estimating 5,000 residential customers, and each one of them paying $120 a year. In terms of the water, it's a much different number, much bigger number, and I would like to see in our budget reflect the philosophy of let's return some of this largesse that we get from the sea tax and from the solar fields to our residents in terms of some mitigation on these connection fees. I think that that would have a warm and fuzzy feeling for many people that feel that they're getting some advantage out of especially the solar fields. In terms of the employees, I have no problem with the employees. I just want to see in black and white, in more than one sentence, a justification, both financial and functionary, for why we need to have the new employees. So that's my piece.
Thank you. Mr. McManus, you have more?
Yes. Looking at the utilities as a whole, it appears that the revenues being generated by the utilities exceed expenses by $3 million. That's just bottom line figures if you add up everything that was in our...
So you're combining them back together now?
Yes, just to put a ballpark figure on it, showing that the revenues exceed the expenses currently by $3 million. So the $3 million does what?
That is to use towards future capital projects.
So reserves?
I guess. And I wanted to add one other thing. There's a rate study scheduled for next year, but there's also some structure analysis studies for Condition assessment. So the condition assessment studies have to be done in conjunction with the rate study because they can't develop what the rates should be if they don't know what the condition of the system is. So those are some of the big question marks going forward, and if you choose to, stop with the rate increases, then you could have a big surprise at the end where, wow, we have these major problems and we need to raise rates by this large amount because we've discovered some issues. On the other hand, I think the connection fees would be a good question to ask the person doing the rate study to maybe look at other areas and how those are calculated and charged so that we could make a decision based on what other communities do with regards to these fees and what they charge and how we stack up against that.
Well, as far as the water fund goes, it's pretty clear that the reason we saw that enormous increase in I believe it's actually called the basic service charge, went from $5 to almost $40 per month, is to pay off the debt from the raw water project. I mean, that's the problem with the water fund, is paying off that debt from that project. Is that correct?
Do you want to address that?
We also had another increase that was in the past couple of years that passed through from SNWA.
Correct. So you have the drought surcharge as well as the infrastructure surcharge that are included in our base rate, which is different from what the other agencies have done. That's a separate line item on their bill. That's close to about $13 a month. So that's part of the difference as well as the debt service.
Okay, yeah, the debt service is $2.3 million per year out of the water fund, and the water fund total budget per year. If we just look at these projected shortfalls, if we don't go with that in no year until the end, which, again, some large numbers float around there. If we didn't have the debt service, we'd be running in the black with no increase.
Now let's pay it
Oh,
off.
I know, we can't get away from mistakes that were made in the past. I understand that. Projects that were put in place that were probably unnecessary, at least in terms of scope, we're paying for. We get that, that we're doing that. But to get back to another thing with the solar lease money, something I had asked for last year was that we treat that not as an enterprise fund, but as a separate account that we budget out of. That doesn't appear to be the case. We just mix that money in with our general fund and go about our business. And I really feel that that's an error and would make it much easier to say where we can project that increases to the solar lease revenues for other things. And other things might be for our utilities rather than continually raising rates on the ratepayers. We could say, you know what, that's found money out there. It's money we never had before. So let's find a place that benefits our citizens. And I understand that some of these new employees would do that, but we keep raising their rates. We keep getting money from one source, saying, sorry, we can't help you. We're going to have to charge you more for these other things. At some point, as that fund grows, we've gone from what, 8 million in solar lease revenue to projected 14 million over the course of 5 years, 6 years.
It's 14 million total for fiscal year 1920.
Projected. And as I say, I think that's around a $6 million increase over the past 5-6 years.
That's probably the case. I don't have those numbers in front of me.
And yet, we're showing deficits, we're showing all this kind of stuff. Folks, and I don't expect you to answer the question. The point I'm trying to make is folks begin to wonder, if we have all these millions of dollars that roll into the city every year, why is it that we don't seem to be able to get ahead of anything?
Well, with regards to the leases, I believe that direction came from the council, how they wanted us to allocate those funds. So I believe so, I'm not.
Well, it wasn't my
positive.
direction, but apparently my direction wasn't the accepted direction, but.
Well, I'm just trying to do what I was directed to do at the.
Yes, and again, this isn't, I'm not trying to find fault or anything with what you're doing. The point I'm trying to make is that when we don't do what I had suggested, I think we run into these situations where the money goes into the general fund and just kind of disappears into other things rather than our utilities, which seem to be our number one problem. That's a statement rather than a question.
I'll take it that way. Okay, yeah. I was going to say something, but I think it's already been said, so. Okay.
I just need to interject. During most of the time that I've been on council was during recessionary times, and the solar leases bailed us out during those times and kept the city running.
Yes.
So that's why it was going into the general fund. So we were able to keep functioning where a lot of municipalities went into debt and were laying off people and doing everything they could to survive. So it wasn't that they were willy-nilly we weren't paying attention to them. They were being used to keep our city afloat. So just in the last couple of years, have we been in a position where we've had a little surplus that we can look at these things? And I'm not saying that what you're suggesting isn't valuable or that we can't do it, but we weren't in a position that we could at that time.
Well, I understand that, and I understand that the recession had a big impact. There were employees' positions that were not filled. I know there were statements made over the past years that, oh, the city never laid anybody off, but clearly when you look at the numbers, there were positions that did not get filled during that recession period.
Exactly.
So the point being the statement that nobody got laid off, well, okay, maybe a person didn't get a pink slip, but when somebody left, they didn't get replaced. So I understand that money was able to do that, but that's 11 years ago. And over that course of time, these solar lease revenues have increased. They haven't been flat, they've increased. And the only thing we seem to be able to do with that money is charge the ratepayers more for their utilities, put new staff on, and again, there just doesn't seem to be a way to get that money to work for the citizens here with the way we're budgeting it now, which again is why I would like to see that solar lease money treated as a fund where we specifically target projects that we're going to do. We live off the money that every other city gets, which is our property taxes, the sales tax, that type of thing. We get this 30% dividend from these solar leases, and yet we never seem to be able to get that money to do things that lower rates for citizens here.
I have a question for you, Diane. So our utility rates at this point, they just increase annually, 2.5%.
The water and sewer rates are scheduled for that to take effect this July 1st, a 2.5% increase. The electric rates are only scheduled for that to happen next July 1st.
So the next,
There are some increases for the electric, but it's based on what the rate study had said they needed to be. It's not a 2.5%, it's incremental amounts.
right, but I thought we kind of got through all those by now, and we're at an annual increase level.
The last one is the electric this year, but then it's 2.5% after that.
Okay. So typically, utilities do have an annual increase worked in. This is the problem we had coming up to this last utility rate study we did 4 years ago, and I first got on council, is, you know, that's what we were looking at, is that we hadn't increased rates in 10 years, 8 years, and we had to make some hard choices to get us back to a level where we needed to be. But I'd like to see at some point where this just kind of levels off and we're not doing these like 2 increases a year, you know. we're back to a healthy annual increase. And by the way, that 2.5% should be in line with the consumer price index or inflation, or, I mean, right, it should, that's the idea of the 2.5% increase, just like you would see in a commercial lease or anything else.
Correct, and it's not unusual in the utility business that utility may make a decision to do a CPI increase that has an upper and lower limit. The water district, as an example, has a lower limit of 1.5% and an upper limit of 4.5% based on a CPI West Coast adjustment. But it is standard in the utility that you would try to keep these rate increases at a nominal level because you are having to address conservation. You're outside of the capital and the construction cost increases. You're having to address the fact that people are using less water, but you still have to do the same business. You do have to address the fact that there's increases in goods and services and materials, and so that's kind of why they look to try to do that.
As Councilman Harhe pointed out, and after we do this next rate study, if we were to identify some funds that could go back to the people, as he says, where would you suggest and how would you suggest we go about doing that?
I don't know that I could tell you that right now because you're talking rate philosophy, and if that's if that's managing the commodity different than what's going into the basic service charge, that's a question of rate philosophy. If we're trying to make a determination of how we're going to pay off the debt, that's a rate philosophy. Clearly, paying off debt is a good idea.
Well, when we get to this rate study and we work with this an analyst, can we make sure that we get into some of that philosophy?
So that's the first thing we'll do is bring that rate consultant in, and they'll actually have discussions with mayor and council about what that rate philosophy is.
Okay.
And should be based on their recommendations and feedback from council.
The last thing we want to do is overcharge our ratepayers. 4 years ago, when we were making very hard decisions about utility rates, that was my position. It was gather as much information as we can from the experts and understand what we need to do to get back in line with this enterprise fund and get it back where it needs to be. And we need to take the same approach in this next go around, is that we absolutely do not overcharge. At the same time, we have to be fiscally responsible in a way that we plan for our needs. So I think it's a very tricky balance. I think Councilman Harhe is onto some. I like the way he's thinking philosophically about this, and I didn't think it was philosophical, but now I see what you mean by that. But as we get into this next rate study, I want to look for ways to cut and to bring back and to rebate and to use words like that to get these things back where they need to be. I also don't look at the 2.5% every year as an utility rate increase. It's more of a consumer price index adjustment.
Yes.
We did do some increases though. 4 years ago we did, and I remember looking at these figures and really we had like 3 different options of how we were going to increase rates, A, B, and C, and we had to pick one. And that was not an easy decision to make. However, those were utility rate increases. These are more consumer price index related, inflationary related adjustments annually that you should see not just in utilities, but in commercial leases and in construction costs and lots of different avenues. So I'll leave it at that for a minute.
I'd just like to ask, when we do talk about 2.5 being this figure that often gets tossed around as a CPI, a standard inflationary factor, with our Hoover contract, is there an escalator in there each year?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I can certainly look into that. I can tell you, I have the projections for our Hoover purchases in the upcoming years. It's relatively flat as far as increases go.
Because again, and I could be off on this, but I believe out of our electric fund, there's about 3/4 of that goes to actually buy electricity. Not
Yes.
pay people, not buy trucks, to buy the electricity.
That is correct.
Okay, so with the CRC or Silver State Exchange Co-op, do you know if there's an escalator in there?
I do not.
Okay.
I can certainly find that out as well.
And what I'm getting at is when we start throwing around, well, 2.5 CPI, let's just go ahead and toss that on there every year. If 3/4 of our expenses are relatively fixed over a long period of time, then there is no 2.5% increase in that 3/4 of that cost.
I will say this, so the utility fund's much different from the capital fund, obviously, because of the amount of capital, and that's different from the general fund because the capital is so much more significant than salaries. But we also have the goods and services that are increasing and the construction costs. So I think that's why it's important that the rate study has to be done. I do think it does make sense to have some sort of nominal increase to offset those expenses. The water authority has nominal increases on our wholesale water charges. But I would have to look into what Hoover does.
Well, again, the reason I'm trying to make this point is the 2.5 has apparently become written in stone, although inflation hasn't really been at that level for some time. But rather than just using that as just everybody does that. Everybody does 2.5%. I think we really need to look at, is that actually what happens within these funds if our expenses are not related to an inflationary cost? If there is no inflation there and we're charging as though there were, then we're charging too much, in my opinion. So I'm just trying to make the point that when we use that 2.5% figure, we need to be very careful that that actually relates to what happens in those funds and not just say, well, it's a rule of thumb, we'll throw it on there and everybody will understand that.
Right. But, you know,
Can I just interject and ask a question of staff here? That 2.5%, when the rate study is put together and they look at the out-year costs, do they also include capital and, the escalation of capital costs going forward that ultimately comes up with some ongoing escalator?
I believe the ongoing escalation was more tied to in the first 5 years of getting the capital projects completed, and those outgoing years after that, say with the 2.5%, it was more related to salary increases, goods and services, and those types of items.
Can I just add that Mr. McManus brings up an excellent point, and to shed some light on that 75% of these costs are going towards purchasing power. I really would like to know what those escalators are, what they're charging us. I think Mr. McManus is onto something right now with a way that we can get to a rebate or a way to give back. If that escalator, if that annual increase can be 1%, that's a lot better than 2.5%. If it can be 1.25% or 0.75%, that makes a big difference to everybody in town. So I would like to make sure that we really sharpen our pencils on that when we get to that study.
Yes, and I believe that's why the water district did the range, is so it doesn't have to be 4%, it can be 1%.
Yeah, I understand the range, and I guess we could operate within a range. But I'd like to see us even just decide on a fair number that is not just arbitrarily based on the CPI index, the 2.5 that everybody uses for everything in the world. Seems like. All right. Thanks.
I just want to mention, there's no cost escalators on connection fees. When they're in, and that's, there's no increase in cost to the city to maintain a connection fee. But if there is, it'd be so minor, it's to be negligible.
Anything else, Mr. McManus?
not regarding the utilities.
So I'm sure Councilwoman Levitt has more, but are we going to have another presentation on anything, or was that the totality of it? So we're talking about both the utility fund and the general fund.
Well, I want to go back to positions. So I'm trying to figure out the costs for what has been requested for the new positions, upgraded positions, and then I guess what would be considered maybe budget neutral positions. So the cost of non-budget neutral positions, you have a $233,000.16. So is that the historic preservation officer, budget manager, and 2 police officers?
Yes.
So then the cost of new positions offset by reductions in other line items is still $867,000.
Yes, but those are offset by the decreases shown below that.
So is that a cost or not then?
The net, there is no cost net because we're removing those contract services that are shown in the maintenance miscellaneous operating
So that
and
is
contracts.
Oh, so that is
We're bringing those services
Okay.
in-house instead of paying a contractor to do them. So that's why we call them budget neutral.
so.
It didn't add anything to the
So
budget.
you're saying the total cost of of new positions and upgraded positions or reclassified positions would be 233,000? Oh, no, that couldn't be, because that's 233 is for those 4 positions. So we don't really have a cost then on reclassified or upgraded positions?
Some of the reclassified have no cost. It's just a change in title.
Well,
And-
I think the only one is Bryce, isn't it? And I know that in the fire department, they've reorganized, so that's budget neutral. But when I went through all these positions and tried to keep track of all those that were upgraded, some of their increases were as much as over $20,000, some were around $10,000, $15,000. So you add all those together, then that adds up to a lot of money.
Yes, but other areas in those budgets were cut to accommodate those increases.
So then, okay, then back to so the total cost to the budget for all these position changes would be that $233,000.
Yes.
So I'm kind of in the same, and I think you all know from the briefing, there's a similar position as some of these other council members. This brings me back to when I was presenting budgets, and you have the people who are the stewards over the money deciding whether you would get positions. Mm-hmm. So I certainly understand your position in advocating for positions that will help you do your job more efficiently. And not just you, but everybody, because I know that even though the city hasn't grown, that more demands are being made with respect to information and transparency and turnaround on requests made and all of that kind of thing. But it is something that we really have to consider seriously, these new positions, because and I understand too that you've projected over years so that the
show that we're
salary
being
and
responsible.
benefits, yes. Mm-hmm. But it is something that I think that we have to look at very seriously. I think even when we can offset some of these positions, again, I don't know if there are better ways for that, better uses for that money, because it does seem like some of these positions are duplicative in nature, in that when I went through and read all these job descriptions, and it seems like that there are already people doing these tasks, and maybe it's required to have the staff to cover all of the requests that are being made. But,
And some of this is internal control push too, because, we've had some areas where people were, wearing two hats that really they shouldn't be wearing one hat if they're doing the other.
right,
So,
especially in your department. Yeah, I understand that. So anyway, that's all I'll say for right now. I went through, in my briefing, I went through a lot of these positions, kind of position by position, and talked to them, and I think we need to hear from other council members as well with respect to this. Seemed like there was, Michael's here. One of my questions was with respect to the historic preservation position. And I wondered if, at least initially, some of that responsibility could be incorporated into the economic development position that we currently have.
With the council's recent adoption of the 2025 strategic plan, 2 of the 5 goals, managing growth and management and promotion of historic preservation, are going to be goals that will be predominantly administered by the Community Development Department. With the council's approval of the Economic Development Coordinator position, one of the justifications for creating that position was taking responsibilities that had been part of the partnership with the chamber and bringing those in-house. And so that resulted in a savings to the city and offset partially that position costs. That is one of the most important responsibilities for the Economic Development Coordinator, engaging with the business community, helping to improve the interaction between businesses and the city, to improve customer service. Another important responsibility for the Economic Development Coordinator is to move forward with the successful adoption of the Economic Development Plan. Similar to the strategic plan, it will have measurable, actionable goals, and we hope to bring that draft plan to the council after we get public input by June. That is going to be a very time-consuming responsibility for the Economic Development Coordinator. So with the goals related to promotion of historic preservation, there is a similar important and very time-consuming objective, and that's to engage the community on the adoption of a historic preservation plan that will also have measurable, actionable goals. Each of these plans are going to require an individual that is going to be devoted to ensuring the successful implementation of each of those plans and the action items contained therein. But probably, to answer your question as it relates to the Economic Development Coordinator position doing some of the historic preservation responsibilities, probably the most important justification for the historic preservation planner position is we need an individual in-house that has the expertise in historic preservation, that has knowledge working with federal agencies that can help to successfully implement those goals and provide those expertise to the community.
Okay, and will either of these positions, I'm wondering if Rafi does this already, when you're talking about economic development, are you including tourism as well?
Yeah, certainly looking at opportunities to expand tourism and work with those businesses within the community would be one of his responsibilities.
Okay, thank you. I'm done for now.
Mr. Schuman?
Thank you, Mayor. So I'll weigh in on the new positions, and I'd probably take a little different approach than others, especially Councilwoman Levitt has so much experience in this field and in hiring and human resources and government entities. I actually have no experience in that, so I'm just going to speak generally about what I see here, and that is, yeah, there's a lot of new positions being offered here. During the last recession, we weren't laying people off. I can tell you that, this economy will most likely shift again. I don't know if it'll be a recession, but it will shift like all economies do. And when it does, these new positions that we've hired or that we put in here they're going to get cut. They're going to be one of the first places we go to save money if we get into a tough spot as a city. So I support the new positions as they are being presented now. I'm not going to get into the weeds of each position and what their job description is. I have read them. I'm up to date on them, but I will say that it's, the way that the different departments run their departments is not something that I really can advise on to that level. So I'm going to support the new positions. I've looked at the financial impact of them. If we're looking at a $200,000 to $300,000 financial impact, that seems reasonable. I think our finances are in a good state. We have some excesses. We have some overages. We have to talk about, like the city manager pointed out. There is a fund balance there of $1.5 million or so that we need to start figuring out what we're going to do with, whether we put it towards debt or projects. Those are good conversations to have and conversations we need to have. But I just want to caution these new employees that come on that, when a city gets in trouble, one of the first things they do is they start cutting payroll, right? I mean, I don't even know if that's right, but most likely, right? They start cutting people's jobs, and we never wanted to do that as a city in Boulder City, and we didn't have to do that during the last recession. But if we hire a whole bunch of new people, and we get into a recessionary situation, that's probably one of the first places we're going to look to make cuts, correct?
Yes, if I could just relay a short story.
Sure.
Very short. But where I used to work, I've had a few jobs, and I worked for a regional commission, and we were a pass-through agency, which grants went through us, and that's how we paid our employees. Mm-hmm. So I had the question from the executive director of, how long can we keep the staff if the grants stop?
Right.
I said about a week.
Okay, so
that's an extreme. It wouldn't be quite that severe here, but depending on what would happen.
Okay, and we'll see what kind of shift we go through as an economy and how our solar leases and different revenue sources are looking at that time. I also like to say that these new positions to me have a lot of worked in efficiency, and efficiency saves a city money. And I'm seeing that over and over on a lot of these positions where we're not outsourcing things, we're bringing them in-house, which saves us money. Mm-hmm. I don't know if all of those savings have been completely accounted for. I don't even know if they can be accounted for. Things like the purchasing manager, right? We can save a lot of money through that process.
We're tracking some of those savings so we can bring that back to you at some point in time.
Good. So I see a lot of efficiency. Mm-hmm. I also see that technology will change the way everybody in this city does their jobs. And so as we embrace technology and change with technology and grow with technology, that's going to change the landscape of the workforce here in Boulder City for sure. Mm-hmm. So we have to be constantly looking for those technological changes. I hate to say it, but machines are replacing people all the time, and we're going to see that. We're going to see that in city government and everywhere else. Furthermore, are we still having the historic preservation officer position? Is that?
Yes.
That's what you were just talking about, yeah. And the other one is the deputy city attorney. So I was a little concerned to see that.
That one has been removed.
Yeah, I was a little concerned to see that be removed, quite frankly. I know it's a hot button topic around town, but that's an important department to us and an area where I hope that we can examine that a little further. I won't really question why it was removed, but I hope that if that department needs a deputy city attorney, that we talk about that more and we bring that back up. And that's not a department where we want to be making cuts. That's a department of any of the departments where we want to be strong and where we want to be. It's not always the most visible department, but what they're doing and I saw Judge Miller's briefing here where we talked about increased citations and the fire chief's information about increased, or the police chief's increased citations that we have out there, that puts a lot more burden on the city council, on the city attorney's office. And so I haven't really figured out why we totally removed that, but I hope that we will see that come back in the near future.
I have an,
Okay,
I have an
yeah.
additional comment on that.
Sure.
I don't really want to do the bidding for you on that, but with my new purchasing manager, and I read off some of the things he's working on, every contract he works on, he sends to the legal department for review.
Okay.
So he's working on a lot of contracts.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to snowball and even be more. Because as people realize his value, they keep asking him to work with them and get more stuff done.
Sure.
So I just want to say that I was a little surprised, but, you know.
Well, it's nice to hear what each department head has to deal with. It's a good narrative for me and for us to hear. However, we have to make kind of higher level choices here with how we spend the city's money, and put a lot of trust into the city manager and the other people that run these departments to be running them efficiently. I'll just say that if they're not being run efficiently, we get to our next budget cycle, we look at that, and that's where we say, hey, what the heck's going on here? We got to make some cuts. But I see fiscal responsibility happening all over City Hall and in our departments, and so I'm supportive of that. I'm supportive of this budget, the way it reads now. I think we've hit on some great ideas. I don't want to overcharge the citizens for utility rates. That's a big one for me, and I can't just blindly go into that without data and without study. So I'm looking forward to promptly getting to that rate study, and also the condition assessment. That's huge. That's a big deal. When you can combine the condition assessment with the rate study, we're gonna have some wonderful discussions about this utility infrastructure that we're all depending on here in Boulder City.
And as finance director for Boulder City, I just feel it's my responsibility to try to highlight the reasons why we probably should keep those rate increases intact until we get that information.
Yeah.
I just feel that's my responsibility. The council can do whatever it wants to do, of course. With regards to positions, if you don't give us the positions, we're not going to stop working. We're going to continue to try to work. It just may take us twice as long to get the job done, and same thing with the rates. If you choose not to charge the rate increases,
we're
then
not really being asked a question on that. I mean, I'm not even sure why it's sitting there in like option. Here's an option, there's an option. I mean, we're being asked to approve a tentative budget today, as far as I know.
we're asking for guidance today because we're running out of time before the final budget needs to be adopted.
Okay. Well, I mean, the budget I'm looking at here is what I'm looking at. So we'll see where it goes, but, if I came to this meeting looking to approve or amend a tentative budget. So that's where I'm at. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Harhay, do you have any input, questions?
No, really, none of this.
Okay.
I had a couple of comments on the employees. When I look at many of these changes, and I realize these are not necessarily new employees, but we're giving employees raises. We're creating where we're moving people from coordinators to managers and managers to directors. Each one of those jumps is another 30 to 45,000. Is that in the ballpark?
No.
Most of those, when you're including 30 or 45,000, that's just not salaries. That's also including all the benefits associated with that as well.
Taxpayer money that will be needed to make these changes, I guess. I could phrase it that way then. I look at Parks and Rec. I think our Parks and Rec department does a tremendous job. That's part of what contributes to the quality of life we have here in Boulder City. But then I look at, we have a department that has people that are getting moved up in positions. Is that correct? These are not new positions?
These are not new. We're, in the Parks and Recs Department, I think we're proposing that one of the positions be upgraded to a manager position.
Well, I also see a coordinator, and I guess that's part of the problem. You know, I printed off all these from what was in our packet, and to be honest with you, it says new, and then it says upgrade. So I don't know if those are new people, or, you know, is it a person who's now coming to work that didn't work here before, or is it a person who worked here before and is just getting a raise?
Most of those upgrades are positions that already exist and have an incumbent in there.
Okay. And again, my question is, when we look at the salary increases, virtually all of our employees, or the great majority of our employees, are enjoying a 5-year period of time where they're getting a 3% increase in their pay each year. And I'm not sure if that's compounded or was off a base.
It's actually a little bit less this year because they're having to pay the impact.
Well, the
of-
taxpayer money going to it is 3%. So, you know, I guess I should phrase these that's taxpayer money that's going to these rather than the money that's going into the pocket of the employee. But it's a 3% increase in the taxes that are going to pay that person, whether it's their benefits or their salary or...
We call it more like a cost of living because there really is no extra money to give someone if they have, like if they do a really good job, they get a review and they're told, you did great, you're going to get your cost of living. So, I mean, I call it a cost of living.
Well, again, going back to some of the figures that have been quoted in here, I believe it's about 70% of our employees are union represented. Okay, so we're not talking about step increases or that type of thing, but the contracts that were negotiated are 3%, and it's not a cost of living, it's a 3% increase. I understand some of that goes to their benefits, some of it goes to their salaries. And I don't know, is that 3% off of a base or off of compounding increases each year?
I'm not sure about that.
The overall 3% is salaries, and most of the benefits, specifically when it comes to health care, that's already predetermined by labor negotiations with the Teamsters. But when it comes to PERS, it's 3% minus whatever that portion of any PERS increase that may occur every biennial.
Okay, but is the 3% in year 5 off of a base, or is it off of the increasing amount over that 5-year period?
It's year over year. So
Okay, so
this
it's
year is
compounding.
3%, next year is 3% over year 1, next year is 3% over year 2.
Compounded.
So it's compounded, if that's the way you're
Okay.
looking at that.
Well, and again, what I'm getting at is if you go pretty much anywhere in America right now and say, here's what your salary increases are going to be over the next 5 years, and you tell them it's going to be 3% compounding over that 5-year period of time, that far outstrips what the national averages are that I've seen. So the point I'm getting at, you don't...
I don't know. I don't
Okay.
know.
I think last month it came in at 3.2%.
I know that unemployment is extremely low, so I think maybe salaries are increasing, but I haven't actually looked it up.
Yeah, last month, I believe it came in at 3.2%, but the overall average over a running 5-year period of time, I think, is still down around 1.8%.
That could be.
The point I'm trying to get at is we're giving raises every year to our employees over a 5-year period of time, that if you compound all of that, they're going to get probably somewhere around a 20% wage increase over that 5-year period of time. So that's, you know, I guess what I'm getting at is we're not being unfair to our employees. But when I see, especially in Parks and Rec, all this movement up into new pay scales, that doesn't seem to be appropriate, especially for a Parks and Rec department. As great of a job as they do, we are giving them wage increases every year. With regard to the historic preservation officer, in looking at other communities, and again, I think we always need to keep in mind that we have 16,000 people here in Boulder City. We're a small town, we're not a large city. And as much work as I think we need to do that's been ignored for years with regard to preservation, I have to look at and see, is this something that the city can afford? And when I look at the position in Las Vegas, which is the only community in Southern Nevada I'm aware of that has a preservation officer, their preservation officer was never dedicated full-time to preservation efforts. And to have a person dedicated to that goal here in Boulder City, I'm wondering if we shouldn't be looking at some type of contract services rather than committing to a full-time person to do that. Certainly there's a lot of work up front that's necessary because it's been ignored for so long. But to say that we're going to have a person come into a community of 16,000 and have a full-time job dedicated to preservation, that didn't work out in Las Vegas that way when they have a person doing that. And I'm wondering, are we just not hiring another city planner? And rather than saying that we're hiring a preservation officer, we should just say we're hiring a city planner who will have a background in preservation or at least knowledge of preservation. I just don't see where we couldn't go the route of having a contract with someone to come in, get our survey updated, get our code updated, get some type of grant programs in place, rather than bringing in a person who's supposed to be dedicated solely to that purpose. And that gets back to, I think, conversations that all of us have had. Are we getting to the point where we identify a need and say, well, we need a person to fill that need, so we're going to add a new employee? And Mr. Mays, I understand, is Michael still here? No.
Oh, yeah, he's there.
Oh, there he is. I understand the special knowledge that comes with this type of thing, but as I say, my understanding is that the person who's doing it in Las Vegas, they never were doing it full time, and they're actually spending very little time doing that now. So I'm very hesitant, as important as I think preservation is, not just to the quality of life here in Boulder City, but our economic development here in Boulder City. I'm not sure that having a full-time person is doable for a town of 16,000. I'm not sure you can answer that because I'm not sure that's a question, but.
Well, I think going back to the council's adopted goals for historic preservation, as you noted, Councilman McManus, is very ambitious over the next 5 years for implementation. We can certainly look at what a consultant would cost compared to this position. The other aspect of this position, besides historic preservation, is supporting nonprofits within the community, which has also been a goal that was identified by the council. So it would be a consultant that would need to provide both those responsibilities. And certainly you can hire a firm to do studies and to implement the action items within the plan that may have the expertise on the historic preservation side, but the day-to-day responsibilities of supporting nonprofits within the community may be another aspect that may be harder to fill by a consultant, but we can certainly look into that.
Again, I don't see that type of position anywhere else in Southern Nevada with the exception of Las Vegas. We have one historic district here in Boulder City. I believe Las Vegas is up to 12 now. And that person is not full-time, from what I understand. Not full-time devoted to preservation efforts.
In the past, I don't know what their responsibilities were, but Las Vegas recently posted for a full-time historic preservation officer position and is currently in the process of hiring that person.
Okay. And again, I do compliment the progress that has been made over the past year that you've been working on this. We now have the certified local government status, so we can actually go out and start applying for some grant money now. There have been a number of improvements that have been made. I'm just not sure we're in a position budget-wise to say, yes, we're going to devote a person full-time to that task. It's a big ask of a community this size, and I'm wondering if there aren't better ways we can do that without having a person devoted full-time to that.
So we'll certainly look into that.
Thank you. You know, another position which I see is following along with the...
Can we stop 1 second? Do you want us to remove the position?
I'm on a roll here.
Well, do you want us to remove the position? Because I'm trying to get some guidance too. Because when I leave here today, I want to try to prepare what will be the hopefully final adopted budget. And that has to be done by May 28th. So if you want, do you want that position removed and us to put some consulting money in? Is that direction I'm getting here?
Are we allowed to?
Yes.
Because we're always told we can't make decisions.
It's not a workshop.
It's not a workshop. We agendized this meeting as a special meeting versus a workshop with 4 possible action in front of it, because we're hoping that the council provides direction. So when we bring the budget back in May, it's done.
Then I would make a motion to remove the position pending further investigation of other alternatives.
Okay, we're still in discussion mode here, and I didn't hear a second, so I don't, we're going to have to get to each of these positions one by one if we're going to go through them. So I appreciate the fact that you want directive, and as a council we'll make that. It sounds like Mr. McManus, we can each express our individual opinions at this point, and then we'll, time permitting, get to it, or we'll do another workshop, I guess.
Well, then I will stop talking, and we can then, once the other council members have had their comments, I agree we then should go through these position by position and say whether we want them or not, rather than offering opinions on them.
I just want to mention that in my earlier comment, I'd like to see again a paragraph that describes the functional advantage to the city and the financial advantage or cost to the city for each one of the new positions. I have to share Mr. McManus's view that perhaps this historic preservation officer is best a shared position or a contractor position, even though historic preservation is a bulwark of what Boulder City is about. Again, getting back to the fact that we're a 16,000 population, we can't afford everything. So that's my comment.
Councilwoman Levitt.
Well, I'll try to wrap up my comments, and then I agree that we need to come together as a council and decide. First of all, back to the lease revenue from the solar leases. When you consider that a third of our general fund is now solar leases, that money is benefiting the residents. So
yes, but there's other revenues that we do not get that Las Vegas gets, like I guess the gaming revenues.
Oh, I understand.
So
my
that
point
kind of supplements that.
But my point being, if it wasn't being used in the general fund, we would have had to get that money elsewhere, which would have been raising taxes or laying people off or making severe cuts. So it isn't as if residents haven't been benefiting from the solar leases. I just wanted to make that point. And I don't want to talk for Roger, but from my notes, you have asked for one reclassification, which was the Parks and Rec manager or coordinator to a manager, is that correct? And then one custodial worker.
That's correct. In little history on this, in 2008 during the economic downturn, we lost 3 full-time positions, 2 32-hour-a-week positions. A department supervisor in rec administration was reduced to a department secretary. We also lost the golf manager, and instead of city employees doing the maintenance on the municipal golf course, we went to a maintenance contract. Jumping forward 11 years, many of the positions have not been filled. And in an effort to, again, achieve prudent financial stewardship as a department, the requested budget in the amount of $146,126 is less than the fiscal year 2019 budget. The upgrade of the admin coordinator to rec manager is a key operation for the Parks and Rec Department. The person fits more in line with existing job responsibilities for the department, represent the city on valley committees, budget area, budget preparation, monitoring the budget, acts as director when I'm not present, and it would assist the director in the proper administration of Parks and Rec, which has improved and gotten bigger over the years. In regards, and you're right, it is a bit confusing. It shows when you look at the sheet, it shows a Parks and Rec manager new, and then you look at the Parks and Recreation admin coordinator upgraded to Parks. So there's only one position being upgraded, and that money will, as per the city manager's request, would be budget neutral because we found the money in the existing budget to take care of that. In regards to the custodial work, we clean facilities 7 days a week. We currently have one senior custodian that is responsible for, as a lead worker, to assist custodial workers or community service people during that time. Because we're a 7-day-a-week operation, we need another senior custodian that would be basically in charge of that person during the weekend, because that's when we get most of our business in our park systems and whatever. So this would be an upgrade of one existing custodian to a senior, and be able to assist in the development of schedules and make sure the job gets done. This would ensure the city's facility, including 17 parks, 24 sets of restrooms, 19 gazebos, 9 ball fields, and over 100,000 square foot of recreation facilities are cleaned on a weekly basis in Boulder City. So as part of the strategic plan, we're also doing a lot of infrastructure improvements at the golf course, ball fields, and so forth. But you are correct. It's only one position. The admin coordinator put up to a recreation manager, and that would really help with the administration of the Parks and Rec Department.
Thank you. And then I just have one overall comment on reclassifications or upgrades, which is on these different positions. And again, I think I counted 7. I know at one time I got a reclassification for the job that I was doing way back when I was a social worker, because I had additional responsibilities of supervising staff that other social workers didn't have in wherever they worked. And I was able to justify that because of not because I was doing a good job, because you don't get reclassified because you're doing a good job. You should be getting upgraded or reclassified because you have extra or extraordinary responsibilities for what you're doing, and then be compensated for that if you have responsibilities for them. So I think as we're looking at these reclassifications, that's one of the things that we need to look at, and I think Roger just did a good job of explaining why that position certainly should be at a manager level. So I think that's part of what I think we will have to go through these position by position and decide, but it isn't to reward a great job performance. A reclassification, in my opinion, isn't. It's because of additional responsibilities or supervisory responsibilities that are involved with that position. So with that, I think I'm finally done.
All right, I guess it's my turn. So let me ask at least one question up front. when Mr. McManus was talking about this is just for clarification, the roughly 3% annual increase to employees that is part of collective bargaining, their agreements that they have. On your year-over-year comparison, you have COLA 628,000. That's not actually something that's designated as a cost of living increase for them. That's just kind of your way of wrapping up this whole 3% annual increase.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Right.
Just a generic.
Yes.
Okay. So, all right, that helps to clarify things. And then another question, just on the agenda here. So item number 2 is to receive an update on the tentative budget. Are you having a separate presentation on that after we're done with item number 1, or is that all kind of wrapped into this, of what we're talking about right now?
It's kind of all wrapped
Yeah,
up.
I was just going to say it was separated like that
placeholders?
based on the attachments and the supplemental material, but we can take it all as one.
And so then also the tentative capital improvement plan is the same thing?
Yes,
It's all wrapped
what we
into
tried
this?
to do is highlight, if you read the staff report, we highlighted all the changes. And of course, since we sent this, there's been a few more changes. So it'll change again, but that was the way we chose to inform the council of the changes that have happened. And I believe we included the two executive summaries too.
Okay. So, I know of necessity, we kind of have to talk about all of this at once, and it's a lot of information to digest, and we're just kind of giving sweeping overviews. When we get down to it, I think we need to, kind of separate out these positions. We're talking about the positions, but then we're segueing into, utility budget, and then, questions about all these things. And it kind of conflates the issues a little bit, but I appreciate the Mr. Hall's information that he just gave there, and I appreciated yours at the start. I think that is important to put all these positions in context. And I think some of that's getting lost in this kind of sweeping overview of what we're talking about, because we've been focusing primarily on the addition of positions, but not so much on what's in the background material, or maybe that what hasn't been highlighted on the positions that have been cut back, or the efficiencies that have happened there, or the repurposing, and that really has to factor in, because what I see in the city, last year we came in with the new city manager, and he immediately came in and asked for some new positions, from some repurposed positions, really looked at restructuring everything. And, we kind of exercised some faith in that and said, it's a fresh set of eyes on what's going on at the staff level. He's the person to do that. And I think we all bought into that. You heard Mr. McManus say that, he agreed with that, and it was catch up, right? And Mr. Harhay said, getting back to pre-recession parity. And I think the results of that have been phenomenal. I think we have seen substantial savings at all levels in all departments. And I don't think we can have this conversation we're having now without highlighting that fact. And I do agree, though, that maybe staff, in the interest of trying to have these executive summaries and digest it all for us lay people that need to make a decision on it, haven't really highlighted all of those savings and cuts and things like that, and not only in last year's cycle, but also in what you're proposing for this year's cycle. And so, when Mr. Harhay says, give us a paragraph on each new position or things like that, I think that's kind of what he's getting at, right? Is tell us a little bit more about justifying each one of these positions, and maybe even more than a paragraph. But overall, what I'm seeing happening here is kind of in line with what Mr. Schumann is saying, I think we're doing more with less. I think these positions and these efficiencies have improved at each level in every department. And so I think that, when we see more positions being proposed this year, I mean, I think the knee-jerk reaction is to say, whoa, we did that last year. Why are we doing it again this year? Well, it worked for us last year, and it's improved. We are seeing these increases in revenues and decreases in costs. And so that's not to say that we don't need to be careful and fiscally responsible about doing it. Anytime you're adding in-house positions, it tends to be permanent, right? It's long-term. It's year over year. The cost of what you call the COLA increases, that whatever the increases are, they happen year over year. Salaries, benefits, everything. And so we always need to be careful about bringing in new positions because we need to justify it to ourselves. We need to justify it to our citizens. Our citizens need to understand it. But the story you started out with, the finance department, I think it tells a real life story about what's happening in our city, just in a microcosm in your own little department. And I think that's important that we do that for each of these positions in every department that we have. Time probably won't permit that today, but maybe we'll get a little bit more of that if we get into each of these positions. I appreciate you singling out the non-budget neutral positions, the historic preservation officer, the budget manager, and the two police officers. Can you just, since it's your department, can you speak to the budget manager position and just give us a little bit more detail on that? Because I've heard some comments from different council members on perceptively, first blush, this looks like maybe there's some overlapping, and I think maybe that's one of the positions where we kind of see that. So can you dial in a little bit more on that position and explain that to us?
Well, I think every position in the finance department kind of overlaps. I mean, the purchasing manager works with the accounts payable. The account analyst works with the administrative coordinator. But when you talk about the budgeting manager, I mean, we do the budget right now, and this is what you see. But the budget goes on all year. There are issues all year. There are questions that come up. There are analytical analysis that needs to be done. That's not being done right now because I just don't have the staff to do it. And that's what this position would do. One of my goals that has been on my sheet now for almost a year is I went to the financial software conference last year in April, and one of the things I saw which was really neat and I thought would really people in Boulder City would really like is the ability to go online and drill down onto budget line items. And I thought that was awesome. But that's a whole piece of the financial software that we're not using. We would have to purchase it, but then we would have to groom our information to fit into that format. And that's one of the goals, and that would be something that this budget manager would do. That would be one of the tasks they would do, is to create the vehicle so that citizenry could go online, and if they want to see what we spend for uniforms or what we spend for contracts, they could go in and drill down and actually see the vendors that we pay and the amounts we pay, and to whatever degree we want. And it was just a really impressive piece of software, but I don't have the staffing to do that. It's on my list of things to do, but will I be able to do that if I don't get a budget manager? Probably not. Will I maybe try to get the folks that I have right now to take time away from what they're doing to work on that? Maybe. But a budget manager would be a perfect place for that person to start digging in. So I have ideas of things I would like to do to improve the transparency of the city, but without the staffing. And I want to add one more thing. Carol, who was the first person I spoke about, the administrative coordinator, after she cleaned up the 90 boxes and then ended up cleaning another office for the purchasing manager, I had her train with the payroll because we had no backup for payroll. If something happened to the payroll person, the city, I don't know how we would pay employees. I mean, I would figure it out, but it would not be easy, So that was a goal, was to have some redundancy there. So she trained on payroll. And this was the first time, I believe, the payroll clerk's been here like 8 years, has never been able to go to a conference, has had to plan her vacations around payroll. She was able to go to Dallas to go to the Munis conference this week with my analyst to learn more about payroll enhancements that are out there. And she was just tickled pink because payroll is today. Carol did it. And we just didn't have that. A year ago, that was not possible. So, that's just another example.
Mayor, if I can interject, some other things too that I want to make sure does not get lost here in terms of this particular position. One of the things that council has made very clear in this past year is that you do want financial accountability. You want to make sure that we can go back and track money, and that is actually something that's done through the budgeting process. And before we even get to that point of actually tracking, we need to make sure that we have a good financial system in place. It's called a chart of accounts that, in essence, sets up how we go about doing the budgeting and the monitoring of that. One of the things that we committed to the council, and I think was a request by at least one council member, if not several of you, was to look at how we go about doing our budgeting process and also how do we go about monitoring. This position, in essence, the budgeting management position, would do that very function. So one of the initial things that they will do in this next year is that they're going to assist through Munis setting up the whole new chart of accounts using modern financial management practices. And then from there, much like the request that we've heard, not once or twice, but probably several times, about how do we go about using the special revenues that we do receive, for example, solar leases, and show those revenues coming in and then attach expenses to those actual revenues, so then you can track them, by revenue sources, or you can track them by program or project. That can be done if the system is set up in such a way, and this position would be able to do that. Currently today in finance, we just do not have the capability from staffing as well as just, understanding of the system to be able to do that going forward. Also, you will find that in most financial organizations, most organizations overall, and also from the financial, I want to say, I don't know if it's Gatsby or one of your professional recommendations, those societies. They talk about separating of duties and responsibilities to make sure that you don't have the same individual, that makes decisions, signs the checks, receives the assets and whatnot. You want separation. That's called internal controls. Typically, your budgeting process is completely separate from your accounting process. So the people that put together the budget and monitor the budget are separate from the people that actually do the accounting, that receives the bills, that pays the bills, and so forth and so on. And purchasing is the third arm that goes out and does all the contracts, so that you keep all those separate to the degree that you can. Obviously, in smaller organizations, sometimes that's very difficult.
Marcia.
Was that Marcia?
That means you're done.
I suppose that means I'm done. So we want to make sure that, we do recognize that we're not a very large organization, but, to the extent that we can provide those services, enhance those financial services, ultimately the payback to the organization and to the community as a whole is better accountability, better management of our fiscal resources, and ultimately being able to tell the story in such a way that it is understood not only by you, the council, but also the community as a whole.
Thank you, and I appreciate that additional explanation. I feel like that our finance department was one of the ones that was most understaffed of any department when you came on board. And when our city manager came on board last year, and as you heard Mr. Harhe say earlier, budgeting is one of the most important things we do every year. In fact, as I was walking into the building last night, and I hope Mr. Reel doesn't mind me saying this, but Marty Reel out there, who's been in the accounting industry for years and years and years, was making a comment to me. We still have leaps and bounds to go to making this more understandable and transparent to our citizens in terms of the budgeting process and what all the numbers are. And he's a professional at it, and he can't dig into it. And so if he can't, then how can the rest of us do that, right? And transparency, we hear it over and over and over again. It's something we've heard over the last several years. We need to be better at that. The fiscal responsibility side of it, as well as our city manager has mentioned, it's part of our strategic plan. Again, it's one of our top 5 goals. It has been one of our top 5 goals, or our top however many we had before. In our past strategic plan, it needs to always be one of our top strategic goals. And we can't do that unless we give you the resources you need to do that. So I'm not a professional, obviously, in terms of finances, but to me, that position is justified. I'm always trying to keep an open mind in these things, and I'm willing to listen to other specifics on that position. But I really feel like finances needs to stay at the top. Transparency needs to stay at the top. This kind of separation that our city manager has talked about in terms of accounting, from budgeting, from purchasing, I believe in that. I think that builds confidence from our citizens. And if our citizens don't have confidence in the one thing that affects their pocketbook, they're not going to have confidence in anything else. And so, to me, that's an important position that we need to do.
I had another analogy when I had a little trouble sleeping last night, thinking about this morning and how I wanted to try to explain things. And if you think about some of these home fixer-upper TV shows where you buy a house and it looks great, and then you get inside and you decide you're going to tear down a wall, and then you find termites. I mean, we haven't found termites, but we're looking at things, because I do have a couple more staff than I had last year, and we look at something, we say, oh, we need to work on that, and then we work on that, and we're like, oh my gosh, we need to work on that. Oh, and we need to work on that. So it's like every time we think we're at the bottom of something we need to fix, there's something more we need to fix. So that's kind of been the year for me. And my staff says, well, you look a lot calmer than you did a year ago. I'm like, yeah, but it's still, I wake up and I'm like, gosh, there's so much we got to do. So, I hope I've convinced you a little bit that maybe this position is warranted.
All right, so I have gazillions of other things to say, but while we're on the topic of the proposed budget manager position, do we want to discuss that at this point, Mr. McManus?
Well, I think in the interest of time, maybe we ought to just go through all of these new positions. Each council member can advocate for or against the position, but I think we ought to vote if we decide not to do one. Whichever department it is can come up and defend it and maybe convince us otherwise. But we have a lot here. We've been at this now for 2 hours. We probably need to start making some decisions.
Okay, well, I have a lot more to say on a lot of other things, but let's do that one position. So,
well, again, I think we ought to go through. I mean, I've got 20 pages here. Again, some of these are upgrades but I think we can move through these fairly quickly.
Okay, well, this one's a good one to start with, so I'm going to start with that one. Go ahead, Mr. McManus, on that particular position.
Well, I'll move to accept this as a new position.
Any further discussion on this position, the budget manager position?
I've been persuaded.
All right, I will second that. So I guess we're going to do this kind of one by one, but all in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Any opposed? And that motion carries unanimously. Why don't we jump to the 2 police officer positions? I know that there's some justification there in connection with more cops, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Honorable Mayor and Council, the reason these 2 positions are in the budget is we've done an audit of previous years' more cops funding. That's the sales tax override that was done back in 2005, 2006 timeframe. Turns out that the law does require that you maintain general fund support to public safety at the same levels, regardless of whether or not more cops goes up or down, or I should say, consolidated sales tax and general fund dollars supporting the public safety, that must be maintained at the same standard of at 2007, 2008 levels. During the audit, what we found is that what did not occur, and in order to get us back to that level, that there is a total of 3 positions that need to be done in order to get us back to that pre-recessionary stance that we were at. So in order to do that, the police chief is recommending that we move forward with 2 positions this next coming year, and then the 3rd one will be the following year. So obviously we have the need to not only recruit the police officers, but also potentially put them to the academy and then do field training. And so to bring 3 on board may be a bit too much. And so we've agreed to do 2 in this next year and then 1 in the following year. And that's the reason for these 2 positions. And these are 2 of the 4 positions that are not budget neutral.
And for my edification, the public's edification, if we chose not to do that, what would be the ramifications?
Well, if we chose not to do that, we do recognize that we are not meeting the intent of the law that was passed back in the mid-2000s dealing with more cops. So we would have to come back to the council and again recommend very strongly that in order for us to maintain the more cops funding, which currently provides I don't know how many positions we fund. It's 6 total more cops that could be in jeopardy, and that funding could be pulled from Boulder City, and we would lose those 6 positions.
Council, any input?
If we do experience another recession, sales tax revenue falls, more cops funds fall, are we still obligated at that 2005 level?
Since the initial passage of the More Cops Fund, because of the recession that did occur starting in 2009, the state legislature recognized that that was not the best way to manage if in fact you had revenues that are, basically, our sales tax, they're both tied to sales tax. If one falls, the other is going to fall as well. And it's not possible for any organization to, keep one funded at 100% while the other one is dropping substantially. So the law was updated to say that if the more cops revenues are going down, that then general fund could go down in essence parallel or at the same decreasing level as the more cops. But as you add more cops funds, then you would have to bring that general fund commitment back up to that level as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And would remind us that maintaining a high level of public safety is one of our top five strategic plan goals. Again, can you, Mr. City Attorney, just speak to the increased, and maybe the police and the court need to do that as well, but just into the increased caseload in terms of traffic and things like that on I-11, and is that impacting our need for our officers?
And I'm happy to speak on this. The report actually comes from the municipal court, but Judge Miller is also here. The stat that we received was 6 months prior to the opening of I-11 versus the 6 months after. There was an 80% increase in citations that were issued to the court. And those citations obviously come via our law enforcement, but it also obviously impacts the city attorney's office and the municipal court because we prosecute and administer those citations. All contested citations come through the city attorney's office. Uncontested and end up in the municipal court, obviously, and are adjudicated in the municipal court. The uncontested citations go directly from the police department to the municipal court. So that's one of the items that we've noticed that we've seen increase.
Can you just remind us what these two new positions would be used for?
I don't believe the chief has specifically identified yet, but he's looking at a position that would be a community service type of officer to go out and connect with the community and schedule things like National Night Out, coordinate those types of things, and do problem solving in areas where we may have a specific problem. Also maybe some emphasis on a little bit of narcotics enforcement that we don't do right now, which of course contributes to burglaries and all sorts of other crimes in the area. And those are the two things he's been talking about with me.
All right, thank you.
And so these positions that the commander is talking about are patrol activities, and so therefore those patrol officers could be used for enforcement as need be, and can also back up other units as well.
Okay, any further discussion on these two positions?
Question with the increase in all of the citations that are being written, the revenues that are generated by that, those stay with the municipal court, or?
There are certain revenues that are generated. Part of that goes to the state. Part of that actually stays in municipal court, not the substantial portion. I think maybe 50% or so, Judge.
That's the most complicated part of my job, trying to figure out where this all money, because there are 6 different statutes that provide where the money goes. There's a base fine that is assessed. The fine goes to the general fund. So the initial fine goes to the sponsoring agency. Although there's some discussions, I watched a committee meeting in the assembly from last Friday where there's concern that that money is not going to the state that they think should go to the state, but that will get worked out, I'm sure, through the administrative office of the courts. But so the initial fine, and that depends upon the agency that writes the citation. So in the municipal court, the majority, probably 90% comes from our police department. So it goes into our general fund. But in addition to the fine, there are what we call administrative assessments. There's an administrative assessment that funds of the administrative assessment, $7 stays with our city and goes into our court fund that we use to fund a lot of our needs. $3 of that assessment goes to the county, and then anything above that, and that fund can go from anywhere from $10 up to $100. If there's money above that, that's a percentage of the actual fine. It will go to the administrative office of the courts to fund the administration of the courts throughout the state, and part of that money actually comes back to us through a grant for our specialty court, for our drug court. Then there's also a facility fee that's added on top of the fine, and that comes back to the court to help us fund facility issues. And we're using that fund right now to build an extension on the courthouse to actually house the city attorney, the prosecutor over there, for security issues and and also to provide conferencing areas that are required by the NRS for attorneys and for victims of domestic violence. There's also a fund that for collection efforts. So if a fine does not get paid and we have to go and try and collect that, then we can add up to $100 on that to fund the efforts to go out, and that's part of the money that we're using on our new position for Marshall. Half of his responsibilities will be collecting money, so we'll take money out of that collection fund to pay for his salary. So there's others. Genetic testing for felons, we have to collect $5 on top of our fines that goes to the Department of Corrections for genetic testing of felons. So every time a felon is arrested, their genetic markers are collected. There's some domestic violence funding, $5 I think that we collect to go to those. So I'm not sure at this point after this explanation what the initial question was. So I'm sorry.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is, we see a workload from your statement in here. The bypass has certainly required an increased enforcement effort. We unfortunately sustained another fatality out there yesterday. I believe you had a figure in there that the top speed clocked has been 131 so far. We have a number of citations being written for 100-mile-an-hour excess. More people are going to die if that continues. So what I'm getting at is we're looking at adding these 2 police officers in part, not in total, but in part, because of the increase that we're seeing resulting from the bypass. However, that is also generating revenue. We don't want to get a reputation as being a speed trap, which Boulder City had at one time. But what I'm getting at is we're adding officers. We have an increased need on the bypass. However, revenue is being generated because people don't seem to know what 65 means. And
in the budget process, we actually considered that, but so in the revenues are reflected, the additional revenues are reflected in there. We anticipated that with the increased caseload, more money is going to be coming in, and in fact, we've seen more money coming in, so we've reflected that in our budget that there'll be more money generated through this enforcement effort.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any further discussion on these 2 positions? Yeah, Officer Mannequin used to be a really cost-effective speed trap guy out there.
Until he was kidnapped.
Until he was kidnapped, that's right. All right, I'll go ahead then and move to approve these 2 positions.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries unanimously. So since we are still on the non-budget neutral positions, let's move to the other one, which is Historic Preservation Officer. I know Mr. McManus has given a little bit of input on that. Again, I'll remind everybody that historic preservation is one of our top 5 strategic plan priorities, and I think everybody agreed, strong consensus that it needed to be. I understand the comparison to Las Vegas. I know Las Vegas is better, or bigger, not better, bigger in terms of population and in terms of facilities that could be preserved, I suppose. On the other hand, I'm not sure that we want to hold Las Vegas up as the model of historic preservation. It isn't and has never been. So this is going to be, again, something that we want to emphasize going forward. I don't know if it has to be a full-time position, but I think what I'm hearing in terms of what Mr. Mays was talking about is a lot of, especially the front end side of things, is going to be the outreach to the community. And it sounds to be heavily front end loaded as we figure out our priorities, go out to get funding, get a plan in place, all of those things. So I know, at least in my opinion, that it's an important position to have, and I think it does need to be somebody that's dedicated, at least primarily, to historic preservation. And I appreciate the explanation on the difference between that role and what our economic development manager, coordinator is doing and is going to be doing. I think that if we're going to make it an emphasis and we don't give the resources, put the resources behind it, then we can't come back later and say we didn't give it enough effort. We need to provide the resources, and as been talked about in the past, historic preservation can and should be an economic development generator, and I believe this is a position that's going to do that as well.
Mayor, may I just interject? One of the things also to consider about this position, that as you move forward with this particular program, and there are grant opportunities, that many of these grants carry an administrative tail in which you can actually put against the administrative portion of the grant, costs related to administering the grant. So this position would, in essence, be administering some of the potential future grants that we could apply for and actually receive. So there is, potential of cost recovery of this position depending on the number of grants that we receive in the future.
Okay. So anyway, I really feel like this is an important position. Can you remind me again what Diane, what the total package is on the cost of this position?
It was originally, I believe, at 98, and now it's at 82.
That's just the salary
That's
aspect?
just the salary. It's
So
now
for
120.
124.
Yes.
That's
With
salary
benefits.
and benefits?
Yes.
Okay. All right, any further discussion?
I'd just like to make a comment that, as much as Las Vegas likes to blow things up, they actually have done an outstanding job with their preservation. They identified the neighborhoods that were there that had architectural significance to them, history relating to the origins of the city. They hired a preservation officer quite some time ago. As I mentioned earlier, they, I believe, have 12 districts there. They developed their guidelines for each of those districts. They have done quite a bit of work. And the population of Las Vegas supporting that is 650,000 people. The population of Boulder City is 16,000. I would certainly argue that our historic significance to not just Southern Nevada, but all of the United States is much more significant than preserving 1950s architecture, as much as I like 1950s architecture. So I see the value here. My question is, again, just because we identify a need, do we then automatically hire a person to take care of that need? I think that there are opportunities for contracts to be looked at with regard to grants. At one time we were supposed to have a person dedicated to grants here in the city government. I guess that person's changed roles, but we get into this overlapping responsibility thing where we're setting up a box and saying this box can only be handled by a person. Grants are certainly important with regard to preservation, but do we have other people who can pursue that I understand there's some level of expertise needed, but we see that with all types of things. I know Chief Nicholson with the fire department has recently gotten a couple of different grants that have come into the city. A grant writer may not have been able to identify that without the expertise that the chief has. But we're also, again, asking the citizens of Boulder City to put on a new employee, as important as that is. And, you know, last year we added an economic development coordinator. Again, we need to start looking at how much need does a city of 16,000 need? I really think we ought to look at other alternatives rather than a full-time position and a position that we're looking to go on forever here in Boulder City.
Thank you, and I don't disagree with any of that in principle, and including the fact that Las Vegas has done some fine historic preservation work. I still don't think it's the model we want to follow. Any further discussion on this particular position?
Did we hear from?
Mr. Harhay, do you have any input?
Nothing further, thank you.
So I guess that we can arm wrestle about who makes the motion first, either Mr. McManus or me. I would ask my council members to go forward with this position. And so I guess I'll make that motion.
Yeah, second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed?
Nay?
Mr. Harhay, we didn't hear from you. Was that an aye or an a?
Nay.
Okay, so that position passes 3-2 with a dissent from Mr. Harhay and Mr. McManus. Okay. So our city attorney, deputy city attorney has been pulled off. And so we also have the administrative services manager reclassification or repurposing. I don't know that does anybody feel strongly about that? It's budget neutral, just a name change as far as I can tell. But.
For which position?
Administrative services.
It's your administrative services officer. Now the title will be administrative services director.
Okay, and by budget neutral, we mean
there is no additional cost. In fact, that this is actually a cost avoidance, future cost avoidance that, should Mr. Bryce Bolt decide to retire sometime in the future, the replacement would actually come in at a lesser pay range than the current incumbent is at.
You don't necessarily have to make a motion because if you don't, then it will go forward as it is presented in the budget.
Right. I'm just asking if anybody really cares to explore that further. All right, hearing no one. We've got our two public works positions? There was some discussion on that earlier. Those are the positions, I think, that...
The HVAC and the plumber?
Isn't there street supervisor, public works technician, inspector?
For Public Works,
Why don't you come up and explain some of what's going on here, including what's being changed other than those positions, so we fully understand it.
when you're looking at Public Works in a whole, there's actually 6 positions requested. In building maintenance, I'll combine these together, the plumber, HVAC, and facilities worker. What we're trying to do is bring the contracted services in-house. Looking at the budget, we actually removed $445,000 out of the building or the facilities maintenance budget, and then we also identified other contracts and expenses at about $175,000 for HVAC and other types of equipment. You combine all that together, it's about $630,000 that we removed, and then when you're trying to bring these 3 positions in, it's about $280,000. Just looking at some of the contracts that we've done over the past years, there's always the markup when you're hiring a contractor. There's a markup for them buying the equipment, their profit, overhead, and everything. We figured it out about 45% we're paying extra to hire somebody to come in and do this work. By hiring these 3 positions, we're hoping we'll be able to take care of pretty much everything ourselves. There's still going to be some projects, some contracts that we'll have to still use, but we're hoping to do most of it ourselves.
Potentially, would these positions also allow for preventative maintenance that maybe goes lacking?
Yeah, right now we're just putting out fires. When we have these people on staff, because right now we only have 2. We have a crew leader and then just a facilities worker. They're scrambling every day, putting out fires. When we bring in the 3 additional positions, then hopefully we'll be able to start to do preventative maintenance. In addition, also the plumber is going to be helping out with the pool equipment.
I'm sorry, the plumber, HVAC, and what was the other one?
Facilities worker. It's just a base level facilities worker.
I'm just checking them off my list.
Okay. And then the next one on my list is the street supervisor. Right now, our street supervisor is also our building maintenance supervisor. If we're going to try to bring in all this work for ourselves, we wanted to split those 2 positions. So that's the addition of a street supervisor position.
And I'll just chime in on that one. That's a real need, and I've said it in the last few meetings. Our streets are in bad shape. Yep. We need to get going on updating our studies on that. I know with RTC we have something this Thursday coming through on two action items, I believe.
Yep. Just
to get that study updated and get our funding in place for the coming year, I believe, and I really believe that's essential. And we're going to, in addition to the funding we get from RTC, we're going to have to find better ways to do it. We're just getting further and further behind on our street maintenance.
And also one thing that I want to point out to the council is that the street supervisor position specifically, much of that position can actually be reimbursed by outside agencies that provide us funding for our streets as well, because they do provide certain costs where they will reimburse staff time for certain street projects.
Okay, so we should probably just take the whole public works position package as a whole, unless you want to isolate some.
Well, there are a couple of other positions here that are upgrades, is that right? So you've got 6 new positions?
5 new and 1's an upgrade. The 5th one that would be a new one is another engineering technician. Right now we have 2 of them. One kind of focuses on doing our internal design, and one has been transitioned into doing inspections. In the past, we've always hired out companies to do our off-site inspections, sidewalk, driveways, that sort of stuff. By bringing another one on, we're going to be able to do even more of our own inspections. We won't have to be hiring the consultants to be doing that for us. They'll also be doing inspections on our CIP projects.
Do you project that to be revenue neutral then?
Yes. I just highlighted a few of the projects that can be reimbursable through RTC and through flood control. You got about $630,000 in the 6 projects that I've listed there.
May I just correct the staff member? Or maybe it was you, council member. It's not budget neutral. It actually will increase the budget revenues to the city, because we will be able to save not only dollars, but also be able to charge our time to certain projects. Many of the projects that we have in the CIP, we are front-loading all the costs, including contract maintenance, contract management, all the inspections. If we bring those in-house, we will actually be saving a substantial amount of money when it comes to capital improvement projects.
So bottom line is, we're projecting at least that all of these changes will be substantial budget cost savings to the city overall.
Correct.
And next year you'll do us a favor and you'll come back with a little spreadsheet that'll show the actual savings?
I sure can.
Oh, yes.
I mean,
That seems like a reasonable request.
Yep, that'll be easy to show.
With our new budget position.
Again, positions like this, we're putting a lot of trust in staff, and as we have to. But as I've seen in the past, I've seen those efficiencies happen, and you know, we can't. Nobody has a crystal ball. You can't tell us for sure that that's going to happen. But I know that that's the direction you're trying to head on this, and we're going to scrutinize it next year when we come back if we pass this to make sure that that's actually working, right? Otherwise, we got to change the game plan. That's why we do this every year.
Yep.
And I would just like to say too that I think having our public employees do a lot of this work, that's my preference above an outside contractor, only because they get to know where the problems are, what needs to be taken care of. They're on the job every day. An outside contractor may come in and have to spend some time understanding the situation. I think there are real efficiencies gained there that you may not be able to capture on a spreadsheet, but those efficiencies do exist.
Yeah. Plus, they take a lot more ownership in it.
And you can hold them accountable.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
The voice of experience
Yep.
over here.
And then the last one was the upgrade, the department secretary to an admin analyst. With bringing these CIP, their construction management, everything in-house, and also document control when we get all our submittals for our CIP projects. We've been hiring somebody to do that, so she will be assisting with that, and up to 20% of all these projects can be reimbursed through RTC, of the street projects can be reimbursed through RTC.
So this is in addition to her work performance or her job classification right now?
Correct.
All right, so I will go ahead then, unless there's further discussion, and move to approve all of these public works, the 5 new public works positions and the 1 public works upgrade. Ask for a second if they're...
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
And that motion carries unanimously. What do we want to move to next? Anything we want to pull out of all these many positions to discuss separately?
Well, I think about the only 2 items we have left are the upgrades in the Parks and Rec Department and the communications manager position.
All right, let's take the communications manager position. Lisa, do you want to speak to that, or city manager, both?
Thank you, council members and mayor. The position itself has changed quite a bit in the last few months, especially with the legislature right now kind of going fast and furious with some of the bills that are coming through. 991 bills were introduced, and so having somebody who can be the voice of Boulder City, even though we do have a lobbyist in Reno, Carson City, it helps to have somebody else who can go through these and take a look at them from a Boulder City perspective. In addition, there are some federal regulations that we're taking a look at, disposal boundaries and BLM. So we're trying to make sure that we've got tabs on everything. The position would put all of that under a communications department. No additional hires, but additional workload, absolutely.
And as the city manager, I would request that the council considers this. This is an upgrade to the current position. Not only is it adding the additional responsibility of legislative affairs, but also intergovernmental relations. So this position would be the representative in the region that would be talking with other government affairs directors in other cities and municipalities, talking about regionalization efforts, concerns that may be coming either from Carson City or maybe coming from the federal level, that we would be part of that discussion. So this individual would be on par with the other legislative directors looking at those kinds of policy initiatives. Just in the short period that I've been here in this last year, there's actually been several instances where, for whatever the reasons, Boulder City was not at the table. And we just happened to catch on, thankfully, in time to be able to open up that discussion. And one that comes to mind right now is the land. What am I?
Disposal boundary.
Disposal boundary. I kept thinking the newspaper article, but that is one example. But what we're also finding is that, had we had legislative representation regionally, we could have caught some other issues that have just now surfaced at the legislature that were discussions that were being had in the region that Boulder City was not that was not part of that discussion. Some of it has to do with some of the bills that are currently pending that perhaps maybe we could have been part of those discussions and, not having to kind of be singled out because we were not involved early on in those discussions. I think this is imperative. One of the biggest kind of aha moments, certainly for your city manager, was when we went up to Carson City for the first time. And many of the first comments that we heard from state legislators, both senators and assembly members, was Boulder City. Finally, you guys are here. And I'm like, yes, we are. And we need to have a presence. We need to have a face, one that, someone can say, this is Boulder City. Most municipalities do have that individual. Sometimes it is dual-hatted. In this instance, we're not creating a singular position. We're just adding that responsibility to the communications manager to also carry the torch for legislative affairs and intergovernmental relations.
Remind me what the increase is then.
The budget increase itself is a little over $26,000. That includes some additional funding for different expenditures, such as bolstering our video presence on YouTube. It, I believe, is a $22,000 increase in pay.
So the increase, right now, the manager position is at a $98,000. $100,900. I'm proposing that this be increased to a department level. It'll be the lower level department position, which next fiscal year is at $123,000. So this position would be on par with the lower level positions, department director positions. And currently, right now, the other four would be the administrative services director position that the council just approved. It would be the parks and recreation director. It would be the city clerk position and
community development
and the community development director. Those are the four current positions that are in the lower level department director bracket.
So the $22K in salary and benefits increase,
and then a few additional dollars to do some additional social media outreach, bolster our YouTube channel.
Okay.
And that funding actually did come from some of the things that City Manager Noyle was generous to give up.
That's right. So that comes out of the city manager's budget?
That's correct. I took recurring expenditures that have been identified in the city manager's budget and rolled it over into that proposed department.
Well, I agree with the justification for this sort of legislative, intergovernmental affairs type of thing. I mean, every municipality that has a stake in the game out there has that type of a position, and so whether it were a separate position or, in this case, combining that position with an existing position, I think it's essential. It is true that Boulder City, we're always going to probably be perceived as, an afterthought in some ways, just because of our small population size, because we do things differently in Southern Nevada. We aren't always considered a major player at the table. And sometimes if we don't remind people and aren't out there with eyes and ears, we are an afterthought if we even get to come to the table at all. And I do think we definitely need an increased presence at the state level as well. There are funds that come from Clark County, there are funds that come from the state, and there are funds that come from the federal level. And we need to make sure that our dollars that are coming from those different entities stay high, that they know who we are, that they hear our voice, And yeah, I mean, it's just important. So in my mind, $26,000 is a bargain for those positions. But I'll entertain other discussion on this particular position. Mr.
Well,
McManus.
I would just like to point out, and again, I appreciate the work that you've been doing, but the budget for this position 2 years ago was zero because it didn't exist. We had no public information officer. We had, go ahead.
We did have a contract for $96,000.
Okay, I'll go back 3 years ago, and then it was zero. Yeah, we hired some PR firm to come in here and try and clean up some of the messes we had. I don't think they were effective in doing that. They weren't city employees. We didn't create a new department. We just threw some money at a contractor to try and take care of some of those things. But again, if we need to go back 3 years again, it was zero. I believe we've, at least for many years now, we have contracted with a person, a lobbyist who goes to Carson City, tries to look out for these types of deals, and we still have that person under contract. To say that, again, a city of 16,000 can create a department for this type of activity, I can't justify that. I appreciate the work you do with the communications. I think that was important that we get that added and that we not be contracting that out to a public relations firm, that we actually concentrate on public information rather than public relations. But I just can't see 16,000 people being able to support a separate department devoted to this type of thing in a state where a legislature only meets every other year. It's an important function. I have no doubt we've missed out on opportunities in the past. I just don't think that we're able to support this type of activity, though.
Thank you. Councilwoman Levitt.
Mr. Mayor, with respect to the upgrade on this and the level in the management scheme that this position is, in my mind, there's no supervisory responsibility of employees, and that's one of the things that I look at for a reclassification. So I too am, and again, and I've told Lisa this, no reflection on the job that she's doing, because I think she's done an outstanding job, but even though it doesn't sound, you know, in the whole scope of things, it doesn't sound like a lot of money, but for the level that this position would be on, it requires no supervision of employees.
So let me just ask a question on that. If it weren't reclassified as a department level position, does that change anything?
No, it would not change anything in that I would continue to have those additional duties being performed by that particular individual, or it would have to be shared responsibilities, where we would have to take a look at what areas or what other individuals might take on additional responsibility of legislative affairs. Currently, right now, because the state is in session, we actually have a team of three. It's the Community Development Director, Lisa LaPlante, and myself that have been really monitoring and looking at many of these bills that have been coming through. We've gone out to Carson City twice, 3 times. It's been a while. It's been a number of times. But we're doing that to make sure that we cover, the concerns that we have on certain bills. And during session, it does take a team effort. But my concern is the ongoing day in, day out when the session is not, when the legislature is not in session, is prepping for the next session. Already we know that we're potentially looking at one BDR 2 years from now, given some of the information that has already come out or that is being worked through in this particular session. And to the Mayor Pro Tem's concern about, should a position, be elevated mostly because of whether or not they supervise, although that is a potential variable that you can look at. I certainly see it as if a position is of the level, executive level, that represents the city and speaks on behalf of the city, that actually carries more weight than supervisory. For example, at this current stage, this position as the manager of communications supervises one individual, which is the BCTV tech. Also, whenever we do have any additional part-time staff that comes in and works on any particular projects, would be supervised by this individual directly. But having said that, I think what we really ought to be focusing in on is, this position, and what I'm envisioning is that this position would be the voice, if you will, and the face of Boulder City, representing our interests, representing myself as the city manager, representing you all as the council, when other intergovernmental directors are meeting about a variety of issues that are regional in nature or statewide in nature, or even potentially in front of our federal delegation and representing Boulder City. That's typically not a manager level. That's typically a department or even the city manager for that matter. Oftentimes, we'll even ask the council to also come with us and help to represent the city, because sometimes, as you all know, elected officials, like to listen to other elected officials as well.
So again, back to my question, because I tend to agree with Mr. McManus and Ms. Levitt on this. It just seems odd to create a department when there's really no one else in your department, right? You're not supervising anything. But I still think, as I said before, I won't reiterate it, but these functions, these increased functions are important. And so do you have to have, by definition, a separate department to have an executive level employee?
Well, I do believe that by charter, in order to create a department, it takes a city council in order to actually create a department.
But my question's the other way around. Can you elevate somebody to the executive level and pay them more without creating a separate department to put them in?
I suppose I could create the legislative affairs officer, not call it actually a department director, and give it the appropriate pay. But part of what I'm trying to also accomplish is that, there's known recognition of titles across the board. And when you carry the title of Government Affairs Director or Intergovernmental Relations Director, that is on parity with others of like functions. And that's what also I'm trying to make sure that we create, is that they understand that this position is on parity with the others that represent their agencies across the board.
I might also note that I think it's important to put my expenses, whether it be for advertising, social media, videos, things like that. I think it's important to have those separated from the other budgets, because they are specific to communications and not to individual departments. Currently, they fall under the city manager.
That was going to be my question. Okay. Further discussion. Mr. Harhay, do you have any input?
I'm kind of conflicted on this because I can see the need for improving our public information office, mainly from the standpoint that we've digging ourselves out of a black hole of 30 years ago, and there's still much improvement. But again, I share Mr. McManus's viewpoint of the cost versus the size of our city. So at the present time, I would probably recommend passing on this for another year and to build up a justification for the creation.
Okay, and that is one option, or even come back mid-year if we feel like we need to. Mr. Schuman, any input?
I agree with you guys on that. Yeah. Good points.
Okay, I will entertain a motion then.
To
You want me to make the motion? All right. it sounds like to me that maybe this position needs a little bit more work, and so I'm going to move to pull this out of the current budget and direct staff to come back at some future date, if so desired, to justify some semblance of this position. Whether I'm struggling with how it's a separate department, not so much the justification for the need of the different functions there. So that's my motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries unanimously. So I think Parks and Rec positions, can you just, Roger, give us a quick, you've already spoken on this, but just give us a quick overview as a reminder of what those positional changes are.
Basically, we're asking for a upgrade of a current recreation coordinator, recreation admin coordinator to a recreation manager. We are currently, as a Parks and Rec department, are giving back to the city $146,127, and we're $146,127 less than fiscal year 19. So we absorbed this into our current budget, as per the city manager when we first went into the budget cycle. The second thing is an upgrade of a custodian, a regular custodian, to a senior custodial worker, and that person would be in charge of establishing schedules and checking work done on a 7-day-a-week program for full-time and 2 part-time custodians for 7 days a week. So those are the basic 2.
And in totality, the budget impact on this
is neutral. We absorbed it into our current budget.
Okay, so you're just reworking things within your
We're
department.
reorganizing the main admin section of the Parks and Rec department.
Further discussion? Questions?
Slam dunk.
What additional responsibilities will this person take on? And again, I get back to this, there's 2 ways to look at these things. Is the person doing more work? Are they doing work at a higher level? Or are they just getting a raise because they've done a good job? I guess that is an answer that, doesn't get reflected in the information we get presented.
In 2008, when we lost all these positions, the department had to absorb all of the different things. 11 years later, our Parks and Rec department has grown substantially over 11 years.
Substantially meaning new employees or?
No, responsibilities to the community, customer service, monitoring of facilities, monitoring of actual construction programs that we're currently redoing gazebos, safety surfacing, and so forth. So the basic premise of this position would be this person is a representative for city responsibilities in the valley. This person was the Boulder City representative for the homelessness and was the actual chairman of the committee for the position in Las Vegas 2 years ago. They would help. Budget preparation is a good factor. The budget calculation or keeping track of the budget for our 13 different budgets. Acts as a director when I'm not present, or some of the duties that would be of this person. So in essence, it just, when looking at the total concept of Parks and Recreation would be the second in line administrative position for Parks and Rec.
Okay, no additional employee reporting or employee supervision?
Well, the person would be in charge of the custodians right now. This person would also be in charge of the projects that we're currently doing in infrastructure improvements within our park system. A lot of responsibility there.
Additional responsibility? Is no one doing that function now, or?
This person is doing that function now, and because we didn't have the staff to put somebody else on it.
Okay, thank you.
So.
Others? All right, then I will go ahead and move to approve the Parks and Rec reworking of the positions.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries unanimously. Any other positions that we need to discuss? Okay, let me, and what further directive do you need from us and with regard to
I just want to make sure that
positions?
we're clear that the fire department positions will be moving forward, that the council not discussing it means that they will be going forward in the budget.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and make a motion then to approve all other proposed positional changes in the budget.
Second.
Anything else? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion carries.
And then there's one for utilities as well.
So also included in the utility budget was a change in the environmental compliance coordinator, which is currently vacant. It's been vacant for quite some time. As we analyzed that position, we also had analyst needs across the department for performance improvements, performance measures, budget analysis, helping out with rate studies. So we're going to try and attempt this year to be able to combine those duties into that one position. And I believe it was a slight upgrade to a utility business analyst.
Thank you. I think we just approved your position.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Miller. That would include ours as well.
Anything that's in the budget, yep. So we covered you. So I will say, with respect to these positions, even though we've approved them or in a few cases pulled them off, I think the points that have been made from every council member up here is we do want to see more justification, more explanation, more transparency, just because, I think our citizens want to see that too. And so it's not, that request is just because, in my opinion, is because we're highlighting the additions, but we're, sometimes all this reworking inside gets lost in the shuffle. And so let's just remind everybody what's actually happening here within each of these departments. I would say, you could even do it on a department by department basis for most of these positions. If you feel like one particular position needs to be singled out because it's a higher profile one, do that. But I think we owe that to our citizens to have that as we're going forward. We'll come back with the final budget. We don't need to approve a tentative budget per se, right? Because that just goes forward. All right, let me just address some of the points that came up. We talked a lot about, and I'm just going to zip through these because we'll have other opportunities to talk about some of these things, but I didn't get a chance to weigh in on, for instance, the utility funds and the fund balance items and things like that. And just to kind of recapitulate, when we did the rate increases back in 2016, it was based on a 2015-2016 study. And if you were just looking at operations alone, you would have said, well, electric would have been kind of, a wash. It was neutral. Water was upside down back then. And, sewer it's a smaller ticket item compared to the other utilities. And we always kind of treated landfills separately anyway. We weren't really so much focused on those with the rate increases. But, one of the big reasons we did the utility rate increase in 2016 was because we have all these infrastructure needs. You have an aging utility infrastructure, especially electrical, where we saw projects out for years, not just 5 years, that we're looking at here in the numbers you provided. And I get it. I'm not saying you should have provided all those numbers here, but this was just an overview to give us a 5-year lookout. But you can't talk about these things in a vacuum. You can't talk about the justification for rates or for excess fund balance or anything like that unless you look at why you did it in the first place. And it's not to say you can't change course, and that's why we're doing another rate study coming up this summer, right? We're starting a rate study this summer, and we're launching into some of these condition assessments on our different utilities. And so at the end of the day, that's the debate you have, right, is what you use those revenues for. The same thing with the solar revenues that have come in. It is true that we have gone up in solar revenues. When I came on board City Council in 2011, we were about $3 million a year in solar lease revenues. Now we're $10 million a year in solar lease revenues. We've done a great job in increasing those solar lease revenues. What is not true is it's just gone into the general fund and disappeared. Some of that has gone in, so it goes in 80% into the general fund. That's the policy decision that was made before my time, I think. Probably reiterated it and reestablished that during my tenure. But 20% goes into the capital improvement fund. Mr. McManus is right. That is a policy decision that could change, and we can always relook at that. But some of those solar lease revenues went to pay off. We had, when I came on City Council in 2011, we had 5 debts, 4 of which were major debts. We had 2 golf course debts. One was the interfund loan. The other one was the third straw debt, and we paid off the 2 golf course debts, and we paid off the third straw debt, and a big part of being able to do that was when some of these solar leases were reassigned, we had like $5 million that came in or more that we used to pay off some of those debts. And so, and we still, as has been pointed out, we have this raw water line debt that we haven't until now been able to pay down. But that is a big reason why, in addition to the SNWA pass-throughs, the raw water line debt is a big reason why our water fund is upside down. I mean, you can't ignore that fact that, and we can argue over whether that was justified or not. We all inherited that debt. Because when Councilwoman Levitt came on, that was a debt that was existing, and we were very aggressive in paying down those debts. And we used solar lease revenues to do that. And so when I see on the spreadsheet, which is the City of Boulder City General Fund 5-year projected cash flow, as of the current date, roughly, at the bottom line, you're talking about the available capital, the funds available for capital and debt service. And, that's what you have to decide when you have funds coming in. So again, we did the rate increases primarily to start these infrastructure replacement programs, and we're doing that. And the fact that we're doing it at a clip of about, on the utility side, at about $8 million a year. And if you look out 5 years, you get the numbers that Diane projects on there. If you look out 10 years or beyond, you're going to see that those infrastructure projects don't stop. So are you in a position to start refunding or stopping the rate increases, or can you refund money to the ratepayer, or what? I mean, that's why you do a rate study every 4 or 5 years, or so you can figure that out. So we have options, right? And that's the debate we're going to have to go through, is once we see the rate study analysis, are we able to do that? Are we not able to do that? Do we put it towards capital projects? Do we put it toward further debt reduction? Do we put it towards something else? And,
Well, I think I would point out too, Mr. Mayor, that we are going to have a discussion about this at our next regular council meeting as far as the continuation of the rate increases. So that will be a separate discussion.
that's right. And so, we will have opportunities to discuss that. And it's a bigger discussion than today, but I think what's gotten lost in the discussion today, as we've discussed that, is, we've factored in the 5 years, but what about the 10 years out and the additional things? So we need to keep that in mind when we're talking about it. It's easy to say, well, it looks good tomorrow, but that was the whole problem in the first place. We were kicking the can, and you can't just ignore the out years and kick the can, because when you do that, then you're not looking at the totality of the circumstances. And so I just want to remind people of that. Yes, we are in good shape. The taxes are, the C-tax goes up. Property tax probably going to keep going up. We don't know. We don't have a crystal ball. We can't see, when the next recession is. We hope it's not soon. But we need to be prepared for that too. And so we've been stocking money away in our, reserve accounts to do that and make sure we're healthy. And we need to make sure we have a healthy end fund balance. And so those are the debates you have. This particular council may decide something different than that council did in 2016 based on today's circumstances, but you got to look at it all when you do it. And so I will say that I do believe the solar, I disagree somewhat with Mr. McManus that the solar lease revenues haven't been a benefit to our citizens. They have. As Councilwoman Levitt pointed out, they got us through a recession, and the recession didn't just happen and stop in 2008. It continued forward into certainly the first several years while I was on city council. And, only now in the last couple of years are we seeing ourselves really coming out of that, where we do have a little bit of breathing room. But we still have all these infrastructure needs that we need to deal with. As far as the 2.5% utility, the annual, you want to call it a CPI increase or not. Again, that's one area you can look at, but you can't do it in a vacuum and just say, it's, and Council Member McManus pointed this out, it ought to reflect reality, right? Well, that's why you reassess it every year when we do these budget meetings. That's why you reassess it every 4 or 5 years when you do the rate studies. But we need to figure out if that's enough or not enough, or if it needs to be dialed down or not. And so we're going to do that. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. At that point in time in 2016, that's what we projected would be needed. And based on what I'm seeing in the 10-year out range here, I still think it's probably needed, but we'll debate that. I think Mr. Harhay pointed out some other aspects of utilities that we could look at, just the the fixed charge, and that's always the case. But you can compare it to any other jurisdiction in Nevada, in Southern Nevada, in the United States, and you're going to find that we're different than everybody. And North Las Vegas is different than everybody, and Henderson's different than everybody, and Fallon's different than everybody. There is no gold standard out there. You take your own data and you look at it and you figure out what's best under the circumstances. So can we make course corrections? Yes. Should we? Maybe. Depends on what the data says. Will we be looking at that in the going forward years and even this year? Yes. I do want to speak to just real quickly to the Deputy City Attorney position. I do appreciate the fact that we're being forward thinking in that regard. I think that there's a lot of what ifs there as well, and so I think that's part of the reason why we decided to pull it back at this point. But there's no doubt that as we've heard today, the policing requirements are increasing, the court burdens increasing in terms of caseload, the resulting increase in the city attorney's caseload is increasing. And so it would be imprudent and negligent not to look forward in that. And so I just want to reiterate what I think Councilmember Schuman said, which is I think it is one of the most important areas in our city. It's why it's one of the 3 positions that we manage as a city council as a whole: city clerk, city manager, city attorney. It is right up there at the top in importance of how well our city runs. And if we're not legally compliant, and that's on the criminal side, that's on the civil side, that's on the contract side and the transactional side, it's really important to our city. A big reason why we have these solar leases in the first place is because we had people like Dave Olson in the back when he was doing this, when he was our city attorney, being able to get those contracts in place. You cannot do all the jobs in the different departments and get the revenue streams and maintain costs unless you have a strong city attorney position in there. And so I think there needs to be some more justification in that position, and I think we have time to do that based on the fact that this is kind of a forward-thinking position. But I think it makes sense to look at that real hard and try to figure out what's going to be the most efficient there. How are we going to handle our caseload going forward? How do we handle all these contracts that Diane mentioned get passed through to the city attorney? And sometimes if you can do it in-house, it can be better than outsourcing. That's not to say that we'll ever get to the point where we don't outsource some of the city attorney's responsibilities. Pool Pact helps us with a lot of that, where if it's covered by insurance, it automatically gets kicked out to outside counsel. But sometimes affirmatively, and Mr. Olson can testify to this as well as Mr. Morris, I mean, there's decisions that are made on that on bigger cases where you just have to do that in terms of you just don't have the resources to handle it. So there's always a balance there. And anyway, I didn't want to let that position go, even though it's been pulled off, because I do think it's important that we continually look at that if we're going to make those changes, you bring those back to us with justification. You suggested, Mr. City Attorney, that maybe the optimal time of when that position will be required would be beginning of the calendar year 2020. And maybe it's that time, maybe it's sooner, maybe it's later, I don't know. But I just think that that's such an important position to our city that we can't just let that slip off of the radar. And as with all of these positions, we do need the justification. Our citizens need the justification if and when we get to that point. And then just my final thing on this, what Diane's calling the cost of living increases, whether that's actually nominated as a cost of living or whether it's just this whole 3% annual. I mean, that is a little bit out of our control as city council. I think it's important that we keep talking about it. Mr. McManus is right that, it's a big cost. It's salaries and benefits constitute, I don't know what percentage of our budget, but it's high. It's, like at least 3/4 or somewhere in that ballpark every year. And those numbers just keep going up, and they're going to keep going up because you're never going to negotiate a labor contract that doesn't have some kind of inflationary increase built into it unless you're in a recessionary period where you just, there's really no bargaining power on the other side to do that, because you're left with you cut positions out completely versus, maintaining the salaries and benefits at the current level. And so we are very responsible about how we do that, and we work hard on negotiating. We just had a contract approved coming out of fact-finding and whatever that arbitration process is called last night with the firefighters. And, part of the reason we went out and had our labor attorney involved in that is because we needed to maintain a certain level to keep those costs under control. And it's a give and take. Obviously, we want to take care of our firefighters and our other employees at all levels. And so, and to be competitive with Clark County, with Las Vegas, with these other jurisdictions, you have to pay at a certain level. You can't just say, well, this is the level it's going to stay at, and no matter what, Boulder City is so great that we're going to keep our employees here even if we're paying less. It just doesn't work that way, and so it's a balance. And I think we've done a good job at balancing that. We're committed to our employees and are going to be committed to them going forward. We want to compensate them well within a manageable range within our city. And I also think that we are guilty somewhat in Boulder City of a little bit, because there is more scrutiny here in Boulder City, but we're guilty of comparing ourselves to what it used to be. What were the salary levels back in 2005 or in 2000 and, in 1995 even? We can go, because some of us have come up through the ranks, and some people that are involved in these discussions in the community were even in positions within the city during that time. And it's easy to fall into that trap to say, well, that was the norm back then, and so it should still be the salary level. But the reality is that inflation is real. Costs go up. Construction costs go up. Benefits packages go up. The cost of administration goes up. And, part of the reason we continue to make more revenues is because everything is inflated. The revenues that we generate keep going up, as well as the costs, and you're going to continue to see that trend. You can't control a market. It's a market that's beyond Boulder City's control, but it filters down and affects us, and so we need to keep that in mind. And I really feel like we're responsible in that regard. That's not to say that we just pretend like we're in good shape today, so therefore we're going to be in good shape tomorrow. That is not the case. We always got to be looking at these things. And one of the things I need to applaud staff on, especially this current staff, is, we're not budgeting just one time a year now. We're budgeting all year long. And we're not just leaving these items on the shelf. We're continually looking at them. And staff is looking at mid-year, every quarter, every month, what needs to be brought back to us. So when we talk about bringing some of these things back to us, it doesn't mean we have to wait till next budget cycle. And I don't think staff's doing that. Staff is constantly looking at our budget and making sure that we are able to cover costs, that we have a balanced budget, that we're not just looking 1 year at a time out beyond the end of our nose, and we're not kicking the can. We're looking out multiple years. We talk about it in 5-year increments because you start getting into speculative ranges when you get beyond that somewhat, but you can't ignore the 5 to 10 to 15 to 20-year ranges. Some of these regional boards that we're on, they have rolling budgets that go out 20, 25 years, and there's a reason for that, because you have to look beyond just what's going to hit you in the face 2 years from now. You have to do it. And so I applaud you for a great job on this budget. I think that it's more transparent than ever. Does it still need a lot of work? To Mr. Reel's point, I believe it does. I think we can get better and better, and I think Diane is asking for resources to get us better and better. I think the city manager is demanding more time on budget and earlier and earlier in the year. And I think all of the department heads are working very, very hard to hold their individual departments and their employees within them responsible and accountable for what's going on, and to make this more transparent for us. And to me, that's refreshing. And again, we're going to keep trying to get better on that. So I'll stop being long-winded and ask if you needed any further direction from us.
Mayor and Council, thank you so very much. I just wanted to, first and foremost, as the city manager, also look to the staff and thank them for the amount of effort that they put in, not only for this specific budget, but also what they've been doing throughout the fiscal year since July 1, when they started the capital improvement process. Specifically, I want to thank our finance director and her staff for the work that they put in, not only to put the budget together, but also those last minute changes when they looked at me saying, really? And I said, yeah, really. But they did it with a smile, and today you have before you, the second amendment, which I think clearly defines, what the staff believes was the best budget going forward. So with that, I do want to highlight that our understanding is that we will be moving forward with this amended budget with the positions as has been approved by the council. We will be bringing your final budget for ratification or approval, I should say, on May 28th. And then proceed forward with filing that budget to the state. I did also want to highlight just a couple of things that I want to make sure that we don't get lost also in these budgetary discussions. And we try as best as possible that what we put before you in terms of forecasting is as realistic as possible, keeping in mind that we are aware that there are potentially other revenue sources that have yet to come online, but we know are out there. I will just, re-educate the council that back in 2014, that there was an approval by the council that once a particular tract of land gets sold, that the proceeds of that land would go to the utility fund for capital projects. Or potentially you could use that for debt service payment of a particular loan that we have, that third straw, so to speak. So even though that is not put in the budget, but once that does occur, that it could be a potential windfall, if you will, that could be utilized specifically to pay down the debt of the third straw if the council so chose to in the future. So there is a number of options that is not built into the budget, but once those actions do actually occur, then the council by policy could set forth and direct staff to make those kinds of financial transactions in the future. So with that, unless there's any other further direction from the council, staff will finalize the budget as been amended by the council today, and we will be bringing that budget forward for final approval on May 28th. The mayor will be opening it up to public comment.
Right. So just correction on what you were saying. I know you were referring to the raw water line debt. You said third straw a couple times, but the one remaining debt we've got. All right, so it's our final public comment period. Anyone wishing to speak in final public comment? Mr. Reel.
I'll try to be real quick here. Marty Reel, longtime resident. Today was the first time that I heard that the accounting software you use is Munis. And I don't see anything in the capital improvements listing for software for Mrs. Pelletier, and I really think you need to consider that in next year's budget. The city manager brought up the term of chart of accounts, and I think you need to expand that chart of accounts, which will then help you make your job easier. And if you get some better software, that should help. The next thing I wanted to mention was the infrastructure budget, and it seems to me that, like you mentioned, that in the utilities, there's a $9 million capital improvements because everybody's worried about the infrastructure. Well, the last time we've only had a review of 6 months of this year's budget, but only 1/3 of our capital improvements projects money has been spent. And if I remember correctly, in the previous year, you only spent about half of your budget on capital improvements. So maybe with this staff increase, y'all will be able to put more emphasis on that. And the last thing I want to mention is I disagree with Councilman McManus on the historical preservation officer. And the point I'd like to make is that I sat through several city council meetings and people would come in for variances, especially for the cottages and for the storybook homes. And now I've lost her name. She would get up here and say how busy she is and she doesn't have time to revise city codes. And so I would think that possibly this historical person could help with putting some teeth in the city codes on historical preservation and what the city codes for business or for building really is. Suzanne Danielowitz, she would get up and talk about that, and she doesn't have time to revise city codes, and I think that's what needs to be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Others? All right, we will close our final public comment period and meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for coming today.